Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Vanishing of Captain Barker and the Soap Ship. On a damp October morning in 1872, a ship left the port of Liverpool carrying what, on paper, seemed like one of the most unremarkable cargoes ever to cross the Atlantic: bars of common soap. Its captain, a man named Thomas Barker, was not famous, nor was he notorious. He was steady, punctual, and reliable, qualities much prized by shipowners who had grown weary of flamboyant sea captains who gambled, drank, or quarreled with their crew. Barker, by contrast, inspired confidence through his ordinariness. And yet, this seemingly forgettable man and his cargo of soap would vanish into maritime history, leaving behind only questions and fragments. The context of the shipping trade. To understand the mystery, you must picture the world of shipping in the late 19th century. Liverpool bustled with masts, sails, and smokestacks, serving as one of the greatest shipping centers in the world. The docks stank of coal smoke and brine, and clerks with ink-stained fingers scrawled invoices for goods traveling to and from the farthest reaches of empire. Soap was no trivial trade. Industrialization had changed hygiene habits, and soap manufacturers in England produced vast quantities for households across Europe and North America. It was bulky, heavy, and in some cases, surprisingly valuable when carried in quantity. Insurance firms treated soap cargoes with the same seriousness they gave to crates of textiles or barrels of oil. Captain Barker's vessel, the SS Marlborough, was not a grand liner. It was a cargo ship of modest tonnage, built to endure the Atlantic but not built for glory. Its wooden hull was reinforced with iron bolts, and its small crew numbered fewer than 30 men. They were seamen drawn from the lower decks of society, Irish laborers, Welsh farmhands who had turned to sea, and a handful of experienced sailors who moved restlessly between ships. The man at the helm. Barker himself is one of the first enigmas of the case. Born in Portsmouth, he began as a cabin boy at 15 and worked his way up. Contemporary descriptions paint him as a man of few words, with a habit of pursing his lips as though to hold back what he thought. He was not married, though some accounts suggest he kept company with a widow in Southampton. No one ever accused him of dishonesty or excess, and his name appeared in no police blotters. But in crime stories, it is often the seemingly ordinary figures who leave the most puzzling shadows. The departure. On October 17th, the Marlborough set out with its load, 600 tons of soap, packed into wooden crates stacked neatly in the hold. The cargo was insured by Lloyd of London, and Barker carried with him a set of papers confirming its declared value. Crew wages had been advanced, and provisions were stowed below: salt pork, dried beans, biscuit, and barrels of water. The ship's log for the first 2 days survives, preserved in an archive after being sent by post ahead of departure. The entries are mundane: fair weather, wind steady, crew in good order. Nothing hinted at danger, scandal, or sabotage. And then the Marlborough disappeared. First reports of silence. By late November, when the ship failed to arrive in Boston as scheduled, murmurs began among insurers. Letters from family members of the crew trickled into shipping offices. A clerk at Lloyd's filed a note of overdue vessel, cargo of soap. The sea was cruel, and ships vanished with depressing regularity, so no one yet thought it a crime. At least, not until fragments of the story began to drift in from unexpected places. One such fragment came from a fisherman off the coast of Ireland who claimed he had seen a vessel resembling the Marlborough 3 days after its departure, drifting oddly close to shore. Its sails were slack, and no signal was raised. When he approached, he swore he saw no one on deck, but fog rolled in before he could be sure. His report was filed but not widely circulated. Another came from a customs officer in Halifax, who thought he recognized crates stamped with the soap manufacturer's mark arriving on another vessel weeks later with no record of their legitimate shipment. Were they salvaged goods from a wreck, or had they been stolen and sold on? Theories begin. As with many maritime mysteries, explanations proliferated. Some believed Barker and his crew perished in a sudden storm, their bodies claimed by the sea. Others whispered of mutiny, the crew overpowering the captain, selling the soap cargo in a foreign port, and vanishing into anonymity. A few suggested insurance fraud, that Barker had conspired with shadowy merchants to make the ship disappear, collecting money from insurers while the cargo was quietly redistributed. And then there was the strangest rumor of all, that the cargo itself had been cursed. Soap, after all, was often made with animal fat and lye, and industrial processes sometimes cut corners. Workers in one factory had fallen ill after handling a particular batch. Could the soap itself have poisoned or incapacitated the crew, leaving the vessel adrift? The families left behind. The tragedy is best felt through those who waited ashore. Wives in Liverpool haunted the docks, scanning the horizon for sails that never appeared. A mother in Wales clutched letters from her son, a deckhand, who had promised he would return with wages enough to repair the family's cottage roof. Insurance papers stalled for months, as Lloyd's investigated whether they were obliged to pay out. Some families received partial compensation, others none at all. The name Captain Barker flickered in newspapers but never gained the lasting fame of cases like the Mary Celeste. Perhaps it was the cargo soap lacked the romance of wine or gold. Perhaps it was the ordinariness of the man himself. And yet, that is precisely what makes the disappearance compelling. How something so plain could vanish so completely. The lingering silence. By the following spring, no wreckage had been found. No bodies washed ashore. The Marlborough seemed to have dissolved into the Atlantic as quietly as a bar of soap dissolves in water. But silence, as any investigator knows, is rarely empty. It is a gap that begs to be filled. By early 1873, the case of the Marlborough had grown too large to ignore. Families demanded answers. Insurers pressed for clarity. Newspapers, starved for stories of maritime drama, began to weave Captain Barker's name into speculative columns. What had begun as a minor entry in a shipping clerk's log, overdue vessel, cargo of soap, was now a public mystery. The insurers step in. The first formal inquiry came from Lloyd, of London. Insurance firms in the 19th century often acted like private detectives, for their profit was directly tied to uncovering fraud. If Barker had conspired to sink the vessel or sell its cargo illicitly, Lloyd's would lose thousands of pounds. And so, two of their agents were dispatched: Henry Mallory, a former naval officer, and Charles Dunsworth, a solicitor with a reputation for cross-examining dockworkers until they contradicted themselves. The men scoured the Liverpool docks. They checked bills of lading, compared handwriting on manifests, and interviewed anyone who had seen Barker before departure. The ship's cargo, they confirmed, was genuine: crates of soap from Atkinson & Sons, a respected manufacturer. The captain had signed for it properly, and the ship's papers were in order. Mallory pressed further. Did anyone see Barker gambling, drinking, or spending beyond his means? He asked innkeepers and clerks. None could accuse him of excess. He was quiet, polite, restrained. Dunsworth scribbled in his notebook, character unsuspicious, ship seaworthy, cargo legitimate. The trail seemed to end before it began. Strange sightings at sea. And yet outside of Liverpool, the story grew murkier. A schooner arriving in Falmouth reported sighting a vessel, heavily laden, drifting in heavy fog. Its sails were slack and no crew appeared on deck. The schooner's captain swore it was painted with markings like the Marlborough, but when asked why he had not approached, he shrugged. The sea was rough and I had my own cargo to consider. I could not risk it. Another report came from fishermen off the coast of Brittany. They claimed to have seen wooden crates bobbing in the surf, marked with the faint letters A and S, the soap manufacturer's insignia. By the time local authorities investigated, the sea had swallowed them. If the Marlborough had broken apart, why had no wreckage washed up in greater quantity? Why no spars, no lifeboats, no bodies? Ships, even when swallowed by storms, left behind ghosts of timber and sail. The silence was too complete. The Halifax crates. The most damning clue arrived from Halifax, Nova Scotia. A customs officer named Samuel O'Reilly noticed something peculiar. Several crates of soap, arriving aboard a merchant vessel out of Lisbon, bore the same marks registered on the Marlborough's lost cargo. O'Reilly was no fool. He sent a report to Lloyd, suggesting the goods may have been stolen. When investigators traced the crates, they found the trail ended in a warehouse where the paperwork was irregular at best. The merchant who signed for them swore he had purchased the cargo legally, from a dealer in Lisbon who offered no further details. The soap itself bore no crime. It was ordinary, usable, indistinguishable from thousands of other bars. But the paper trail was crooked. Had Barker sold the cargo abroad and vanished with the proceeds? Or had pirates, smugglers, or mutinous crew carried it off, leaving the captain's fate unknown? The crew under scrutiny. Investigators turned to the men aboard the Marlborough. Of the 27 sailors, most were nameless in the records. Irish deckhands, Welsh farmhands turned to sea, and 2 Swedes hired on short notice. Their families waited ashore, bewildered. One woman in Dublin claimed her brother, Patrick, had written a letter home just before departure saying, "The captain is honest, but I mistrust some among us." That sentence, preserved in a family scrapbook, became a spark for speculation. Had there been discontent on board? A mutiny? Some men said yes. A whisper circulated in the taverns that one of the Swedes had a criminal record in Gothenburg, that another crewman had fled a debt in Bristol. Dunsworth noted in his files, possible mutiny, investigate further. But records were patchy. No witness could confirm discord aboard the ship, and Barker's surviving log entries showed no sign of tension. Still, the theory persisted. Perhaps the captain was cast overboard by his own men, and the cargo sold off piecemeal in foreign ports. Rumors of fraud. Not all suspicion fell on the crew. Some pointed fingers at Barker himself. He was quiet, yes, but perhaps too quiet. Had he planned his own disappearance? One journalist for the Liverpool Mercury suggested Barker might have faked the loss of the ship, living under a false name in America with insurance money hidden in his pocket. The story was tantalizing, but it faltered on practical grounds. Insurance payouts took months, even years. How could Barker collect without exposing himself? And if he had truly absconded, why leave no trace? Men who fled for new lives often slipped. They wrote to relatives, drank too much, or bragged in the wrong company. No one anywhere ever claimed to have seen him again. The curse of the cargo. Among sailors, darker theories circulated. Soap, they said, was harmless enough, but what if it carried something unseen? One factory had produced a bad batch the year before. Workers complained of rashes, fevers, and dizziness after prolonged handling. Could the crew have been poisoned slowly, their strength drained until they collapsed at sea? The idea was fanciful, but stories thrive in the absence of evidence. One sailor in a Liverpool tavern swore that soap bars retrieved from the Halifax crates gave off a strange odor like bitter almonds. The implication was cyanide, though no tests were ever made. The story spread, embroidered with each telling, until Barker's voyage became known as the cursed cargo. Dead ends and desperation. By mid-1873, the case seemed to be closing with no resolution. Lloyd's refused to pay out in full, citing uncertainty over whether the loss was natural or fraudulent. Families protested, but the law favored insurers. Barker's name appeared less frequently in papers, buried beneath newer tragedies. And yet, in coastal towns from Brittany to Halifax, rumors lingered. A captain in Spain claimed to have bought soap from a man who spoke English with a Portsmouth accent. A fisherman in Ireland said he found a carved piece of wood, perhaps from the Marlborough's deck. None of these leads ever led to confirmation. The investigation reached its strangest moment in 1874 when a message in a bottle washed ashore near Cornwall. Inside, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Marlborough taken, all lost Barker." The note was unsigned, the handwriting unverified, and many believed it a hoax. But it reopened the question, taken by whom? Pirates, mutineers, a phantom storm. A legacy of questions. By the close of the decade, the Marlborough had become another entry in the long ledger of lost ships. No wreckage was ever found. No sailor ever returned. The only evidence lay in fragments of soap scattered across ports, their origins obscured by paperwork and saltwater. Captain Barker himself faded into maritime folklore, not quite as famous as the Mary Celeste, but not forgotten by those who study the gray edges of history. He remains a cipher, ordinary in life, extraordinary in disappearance. The mystery of the Marlborough was never solved, but in the years following its disappearance, a series of investigations, anecdotes, and reflections continued to ripple outward. What began as a simple shipping loss became something larger, a tale whispered in dockside taverns, retold in maritime journals, and puzzled over by historians even decades later. The final efforts of the investigators. Lloyd of London never fully abandoned the case, if only because their financial stake demanded persistence. By 1875, 3 years after the Marlborough's departure, Lloyd's issued partial payments to some families of crewmen. Others, particularly those suspected of mutiny, were denied. The ambiguity of the case made insurers cautious. Without a wreck, without bodies, without certainty, they withheld their full hand. For the investigators Mallory and Dunsworth, the trail had gone cold. They traveled as far as Lisbon, combing through customs ledgers, interviewing merchants, and following whispers of cheap soap that had flooded the market months after the Marlborough's vanishing. What they found was frustratingly consistent. The cargo had been broken up and sold through a network of small traders, each of whom insisted they had purchased it legitimately. If Barker had been alive, he left no trace. If mutineers had profited, they did so without attracting notice. The soap dissolved not just in bathwater but in paper trails. Maritime folklore takes hold. By the 1880s, the Marlborough's disappearance entered the realm of seafaring legend. Sailors invented embellishments, as sailors do. Some claimed the vessel was seen adrift near the Azores, crewless, with food still on the table. Others insisted Barker had been sighted in Buenos Aires, living under another name. None of these stories were substantiated, but they served the purpose of folklore, to give shape to mystery. A pamphlet printed in Liverpool in 1887, titled "Cursed Voyages of the Sea," included a lurid engraving of the Marlborough sailing into storm clouds, while ghostly figures clung to the rigging. Though the engraving bore no relation to fact, it cemented the ship in the public imagination. For every sailor who laughed off the story, another crossed himself before embarking on a voyage. The nature of soap and the sea. Historians often overlook the peculiarity of the cargo itself. Soap, unlike gold or rum, was both common and fragile. Exposure to seawater ruined it, humidity dissolved it, and yet in bulk it was valuable enough to attract thieves. One maritime economist later remarked, "The irony of the Marlborough case is that its cargo, in its plainness, invited disappearance. Who notices a bar of soap, let alone 100,000? The Halifax crates became a particular sticking point. Inquiries decades later confirmed that Atkinson and Sons had stamped their cargo with distinct branding. The crates arriving in Halifax bore the same stamp. How could this be dismissed as coincidence? Some historians argued that another ship, also carrying Atkinson soap, had delivered the goods, but customs ledgers failed to support that theory. It was as if the Marlborough's cargo had seeped into global markets like water through sand, impossible to trace, impossible to recover. Competing theories. By the turn of the century, 3 main theories dominated discussions of the case. Storm and shipwreck. The simplest explanation: a sudden squall or rogue wave claimed the vessel and all aboard. But the lack of wreckage remained problematic. Even when ships sank, flotsam usually told the tale. The Atlantic, however, is vast, and some argued the debris may have drifted far beyond recovery. Mutiny and smuggling. Supporters of this view pointed to Patrick's letter about mistrusting fellow crewmen. They imagined a violent struggle, the captain overthrown, and the crew selling the cargo abroad before scattering. But this theory also strained credulity. Mutineers rarely kept silent forever. Someone, somewhere, would have boasted or erred. Insurance or commercial fraud. The most tantalizing theory was fraud, involving Barker or parties ashore. Perhaps the ship had been deliberately abandoned or sold, its papers forged, its cargo laundered through ports like Lisbon. This would explain the Halifax crates, but required a conspiracy wider than one quiet sea captain. Each theory held just enough weight to survive, and just enough gaps to collapse. The families and their loss. While newspapers debated and insurers bickered, the families of the Marlborough's crew carried on in silence. Widows remarried or struggled in poverty. Children grew up without fathers. The widow in Southampton, said to be Barker's companion, faded from records, her name never firmly documented, her grief never officially recorded. In Ireland, Patrick's sister kept his final letter folded in a Bible until her death. For her, it was proof of betrayal at sea, though she never knew whether her brother was victim or perpetrator. For the families, the mystery was not a curiosity, it was a wound that never quite healed. The case in historical memory. Unlike the Mary Celeste, which gained international fame, the Marlborough lingered in a quieter corner of history. Its ordinariness may explain why. There was no cargo of wine, no captain's wife aboard, no spectacular discovery of a ghost ship. Instead, it was soap, a quiet man, and an absence. But historians of maritime law still cite the case as an example of the difficulties of insurance in the 19th century. Without wreckage, without testimony, insurers were caught between financial loss and human sympathy. The Marlborough helped solidify stricter requirements for manifests, insurance claims, and cargo tracking in the decades that followed. A symbol of the sea's silence. To this day, the case serves as a reminder of the sea's indifference. Ships vanish, records fail, families wait in vain, and sometimes the only legacy left behind is a fragment, a crate of soap, a rumor in a tavern, a letter hinting at mistrust. One historian put it best: the Marlborough case is not about what we know, but about what we cannot know. Its power lies in absence, a captain too ordinary to remember, a cargo too plain to notice, a ship too lost to recover. And yet, in that very absence, it lingers. Closing reflection. The vanishing of Captain Barker and the Marlborough did not change the course of empires. It did not reshape global trade. But it did leave behind an enduring question. How could something so simple, a man, a ship, a cargo of soap, dissolve so completely into the Atlantic, leaving only whispers and fragments? It is a reminder that crime, mystery, and disappearance need not be grand to be haunting. Sometimes the most ordinary cases echo the longest, precisely because they deny us the satisfaction of resolution. Story 2: The Post Office Poisoner, How a Clerk Turned Deadly. The post office was, in the 19th century, the very heartbeat of Britain. Letters carried business contracts, love confessions, family news, and remittances across towns and oceans. The red-coated letter carriers were figures of trust, part of the daily rhythm of life. To tamper with the post was not merely theft, it was an offense against the trust that held society together. And yet, within this system built on order and reliability, one clerk quietly turned the machinery of correspondence into a weapon. His name was Edward Sparrow. At first glance, he seemed unremarkable, a low-level sorting clerk in a London post office, whose life was measured in ink stains, ledgers, and the smell of sealing wax. But behind his calm exterior lurked one of the strangest crime stories in postal history. The context: letters and money in the mail. By the 1870s, letters often carried more than words. Banknotes, money orders, and small valuables were tucked inside envelopes, sometimes foolishly without insurance or registration. Despite official warnings, families sent coins sewn into cloth or folded bills wrapped in paper. The post office employed an army of clerks to sort, weigh, and route this flood of correspondence, and each clerk had, for a moment, power over its fate. Most clerks resisted temptation. To steal was to risk disgrace, prison, and ruin, but temptation gnawed quietly. For Sparrow, it appears, temptation was not enough. He wanted not only to steal but also to eliminate those who might expose him. Edward Sparrow's quiet life. Edward Sparrow was born in 1844 in Stepney, the son of a dockworker. His upbringing was modest, marked by crowded lodgings and unstable wages. A steady post office position promised respectability. By his mid-20s, he was employed as a sorting clerk, working long shifts beneath the gaslight of the Central Post Office, where letters poured in by the thousands each day. Colleagues later described him as bookish and withdrawn. He read penny dreadfuls and scientific journals with equal appetite. One recalled how Sparrow once remarked, with unsettling precision, how small doses of common chemicals could ruin a man without leaving a trace. At the time, it seemed an idle observation. In hindsight, it was chilling. The first suspicious death. The case began with a death so ordinary that few noticed. In December of 1877, a clerk named John Foster collapsed at his desk in the post office, complaining of dizziness and violent stomach pains. He died 2 days later. The coroner attributed it to gastric fever, a common and vague diagnosis. His colleagues mourned briefly, then the machinery of mail resumed its ceaseless rhythm. But within months, another clerk, Henry Watson, fell ill under nearly identical circumstances. He too died suddenly, his final hours marked by spasms and retching. This time, a young physician attending him raised a concern. The symptoms resembled poisoning more than fever. Still, without proof, the matter was set aside. At the time, poisons were a grim fascination in Victorian England. Arsenic, strychnine, and prussic acid were readily available from chemists, sold for everything from rat control to household cleaning. Newspapers carried lurid accounts of wives poisoning husbands or servants poisoning masters. But the idea of poison within the postal system seemed unthinkable. Letters gone missing. Around the same time, small sums of money began vanishing from letters. Complaints from the public trickled in. A banknote missing here, a sovereign gone there. The amounts were minor, but the pattern troubled supervisors. They suspected theft within the sorting room but lacked evidence. One inspector noted that the missing letters all passed through Sparrow's station. He confronted Sparrow once, who replied calmly, "Mistakes occur in all systems, sir. The post is not immune to human error." His tone was polite, his manner unflappable. Suspicion lingered but did not harden into proof. A clerk's notebook. What shifted the case was the discovery of a notebook among Sparrow's belongings after a routine dormitory inspection. In it, he had copied extracts from chemistry manuals, including recipes for diluting arsenic in water and notes on dosage sufficient to weaken but not kill. When questioned, Sparrow smiled faintly and said he was curious about science. The inspector, unsettled but lacking authority to pursue further, returned the notebook. Looking back, the missed opportunity is startling. Here was a man, with access to the very lifeblood of communication, keeping detailed notes on poison. Yet in the bureaucratic machinery of the post office, the warning was filed away and forgotten. The turning point, a letter of death. The true crime emerged in 1879. A letter sent from London to a solicitor in Bath arrived unopened, but its recipient, after handling it, fell violently ill. He survived barely, but physicians reported traces of arsenic on the paper. The case now leapt beyond clerical whispers. The integrity of the mail was in question, and Parliament itself demanded answers. An inquiry swept through the post office, focusing sharply on Sparrow. He denied everything, his quiet demeanor never cracking. Yet evidence mounted: intercepted letters with faint white residue, missing valuables traced back to his shifts, and testimonies from colleagues who recalled his odd fascination with poison. Still, one question remained unanswered: why poison his own colleagues? Theft was one thing, but murder seemed to exceed the logic of petty crime. By the winter of 1879, suspicion around Edward Sparrow was no longer confined to whispers in the sorting room. The deaths of his fellow clerks, the complaints of missing valuables, and the alarming case of the arsenic-tainted letter had drawn the attention of Scotland Yard. What had once been considered an internal irregularity within the post office was now treated as a potential scandal with national implications. The trust of the British public in its postal system could not be compromised. And so, quietly but deliberately, an investigation was set in motion. Scotland Yard enters the case. Detective Inspector Charles Fraser was assigned the inquiry. Fraser was a methodical man, not prone to theatrics. His first step was to examine the broader pattern: which letters had gone missing, when, and through whose hands they had passed. The results were startling. Over 24 reported cases of theft all corresponded with Sparrow's shift schedule. The odds of coincidence were slim. Sparrow had been clever in choosing small amounts a sovereign here. A £5 note, their amounts often overlooked or assumed to be lost in transit. But cumulatively, the thefts amounted to a considerable sum. Fraser also revisited the suspicious deaths. He obtained coroner's reports on John Foster and Henry Watson. Though originally attributed to gastric fever, both reports described violent spasms, involuntary convulsions, and vomiting of unusual character. Fraser, who had read recent reports on poisoning cases, suspected arsenic. But suspicion was not proof. Without physical evidence, Sparrow could not be charged. Watching the clerk. The next step was surveillance. Sparrow was discreetly watched at his lodgings and on his journeys to and from the post office. He lived alone in a boarding house, kept to himself, and spent evenings reading by lamplight. But Fraser noticed he frequently visited a chemist's shop in Holborn, where he purchased powders under the pretense of rat poison. The chemist, when questioned, recalled Sparrow's peculiar requests. He often asked for arsenic in very small amounts, for experimenting with solutions. At the time, poisons were not tightly regulated, but the repeated purchases raised eyebrows. The chemist agreed to notify authorities should Sparrow return. A letter that should not exist. The breakthrough came not from poisons but from paper. One morning, a sorting clerk discovered an opened envelope in Sparrow's wastebasket, bearing the faint marks of sealing wax. Inside was a folded piece of paper, empty of its contents. The letter, traced through its markings, had once contained a money order. Confronted, Sparrow insisted it was a mistake. "I was merely discarding spoiled paper." But the inspector noted that Sparrow's fingers bore faint white dust. The residue, when tested, revealed traces of arsenic. The pattern grew clear. Sparrow had begun not only stealing money but also tampering with correspondence, dusting certain letters with poison. Whether to punish, deter, or silence, the motive was unclear. Colleagues recall uneasy details. When investigators began questioning Sparrow's colleagues in earnest, more unsettling details surfaced. One clerk recalled Sparrow's habit of licking his fingers before sorting, then wiping them on a rag. He said it helped with the paper, the man testified, but some of us developed sores afterward. Another remembered Sparrow muttering about how trust is the easiest thing to exploit. A third swore that Sparrow had once joked, "One could kill a man through a letter and never be caught." These recollections, once dismissed as eccentricities, now seemed sinister. The arrest. On March 3, 1880, Sparrow was arrested at his desk. Witnesses later described the scene. He was calm, neither surprised nor defiant. "Am I accused of theft?" he asked. When Fraser replied, "Theft and more than theft," Sparrow simply pursed his lips and allowed himself to be led away. His lodgings were searched. There, investigators found bottles labeled arsenicum and strychnia, carefully corked and hidden in a drawer. They also discovered letters torn open, their contents missing, alongside scraps of paper with chemical notations. The most damning item was a small vial of white powder, labeled in Sparrow's neat handwriting, for experimentation harmless in minute dose. Tests confirmed it was pure arsenic. The trial begins. Sparrow's trial at the Old Bailey became a quiet sensation. Unlike the sensational murder trials that drew crowds, this case unnerved the public on a deeper level. It was not just a crime of passion or greed, but a crime woven into the very fabric of daily life. Every letter suddenly seemed suspect. The prosecution laid out its case. Sparrow had stolen repeatedly from the Post, poisoned colleagues who might expose him, and attempted to weaponize the mail itself. Witnesses spoke of sudden deaths, of missing banknotes, of Sparrow's chemical obsessions. The chemist testified to his frequent purchases of arsenic. The inspector presented the incriminating evidence from his lodgings. The defense argued there was no direct proof of murder. No body had been conclusively tested for poison. The deaths, though suspicious, could not be tied scientifically to Sparrow's hand. At most, they argued, he was guilty of theft and dangerous curiosity. Public fear. While the jury deliberated, newspapers stoked public fear. The Times ran an editorial warning of the corruption of trust within the very institution that carries our most sacred words and transactions. Penny newspapers dubbed him the post office poisoner. One pamphlet sold on street corners went further, imagining Sparrow as the mastermind of a future poison post, in which assassins would send letters that killed upon opening. Though wildly exaggerated, it reflected a genuine anxiety, the vulnerability of ordinary people to invisible threats hidden in the mundane. The jury's decision. In the end, Sparrow was convicted of theft and attempted poisoning, but not murder. The absence of chemical tests on the deceased clerks left the jury unable to convict him for their deaths beyond reasonable doubt. Still, his crimes were enough to ruin him. He was sentenced to penal servitude for life. The judge, in delivering sentence, remarked, "You have abused the trust of the Crown and endangered not only your colleagues but the public. Your conduct is as cowardly as it is calculated. You will be removed from society, where your poisons can harm no more." But questions lingered. Even as Sparrow was sent to prison, questions lingered. Did he truly kill Foster and Watson? Or were their deaths coincidences, seized upon by prosecutors desperate to frame a narrative? Did Sparrow poison letters for thrill or to silence would-be accusers? And most hauntingly, was Sparrow merely an opportunist, or had he discovered, in the anonymity of the postal system, a dark kind of power that went beyond money? When the gavel fell at the Old Bailey and Edward Sparrow was led away in chains, the courtroom exhaled with relief. But that relief was uneasy. For while Sparrow had been sentenced, the true scope of his crimes and the questions they raised remained unresolved. The quiet man who had slipped poison into envelopes and pilfered coins from letters left behind not just victims, but a permanent shadow on the institution he had betrayed. Life in penal servitude. Sparrow was sent first to Pentonville Prison, where new convicts were kept under the separate system, confined to solitude, forced into silence, their daily routine broken only by chapel services and labor. From there he was transferred to Dartmoor, the bleak moorland prison that housed both common thieves and notorious criminals. In Dartmoor, Sparrow labored at oakum picking, the monotonous task of unraveling old ropes into fibers for caulking ships. For a man once surrounded by letters and chemical curiosities, it was a form of living burial. Guards described him as obedient, quiet, and withdrawn. He spoke little, kept his head bowed, and never challenged authority. One visitor, a prison reformer who later wrote about her experience, recalled Sparrow distinctly. There was a curious stillness about him, as though he carried secrets even in confinement. His hands, stained from rope fibers, moved with precision, as if still sorting letters in some ghostly post office only he could see. The families of the dead. For the families of John Foster and Henry Watson, Sparrow's conviction brought little closure. Officially, the deaths remained listed as natural causes, but in private, their relatives believed they had been murdered by a colleague who sought to silence them. Without legal recognition, they received no compensation, and their grief festered. Mrs. Foster, widowed with 3 children, petitioned Parliament for an inquiry. Her appeal was tabled and eventually forgotten. Watson's brother, bitter and outspoken, wrote a pamphlet titled Poison in the Post, accusing the government of downplaying Sparrow's crimes to preserve public confidence in the postal service. Though dismissed by officials, the pamphlet sold widely among working-class readers, feeding suspicion that Sparrow's true tally of victims had been quietly buried. Fear among the public. The idea that a letter could kill lingered long after Sparrow's imprisonment. For years, households eyed their correspondence with unease. Some began sprinkling letters with vinegar or holding them up to the fire before opening, convinced that poison could be detected by smell or smoke. Newspapers printed safety guides, warning citizens to wash their hands after handling suspicious mail. Though exaggerated, these fears were not wholly irrational. Sparrow had, after all, succeeded in dusting at least one letter with arsenic. The victim in Bath who narrowly survived his poisoned correspondence lived with chronic health issues for the rest of his days. His testimony remained a reminder that Sparrow had breached the sanctity of the mail in a way no one thought possible. Changes in the post office. The case forced reforms. By 1881, new regulations restricted the handling of poisons by postal employees. Inspectors increased spot checks of sorting rooms, and surveillance within major offices expanded. Money orders and valuables were more strictly separated from ordinary mail, reducing opportunities for theft. Perhaps the most significant change came in the training of clerks. Before, men were hired for literacy and punctuality. After Sparrow, psychological fitness and moral character received greater scrutiny. Supervisors were instructed to watch for eccentricities that might mask criminal tendencies, a vague directive that often punished harmless individuality, but reflected the nervous climate Sparrow had created. Sparrow behind bars. Sparrow never confessed. To the end, he maintained that he was guilty only of theft, not of poisoning. In letters to his sister, one of the few correspondences he was allowed, he insisted, "They have painted me blacker than I am. I never wished to kill. I sought only advantage in a hard life." But in other letters, darker hints appeared. In one, preserved in prison archives, he wrote, "I proved what can be done with trust. Men do not see what is before them until too late. A letter is a blade hidden in plain sight." That line was quoted often in later accounts, suggesting Sparrow understood his crime not merely as theft, but as a demonstration of power. The power to infiltrate the private spaces of life through something as ordinary as a folded sheet of paper. Decline and death. In 1891, after 11 years of penal servitude, Sparrow's health began to decline. Years of hard labor and poor diet left him gaunt and consumptive. He died quietly in Dartmoor Prison's infirmary, aged 47. His body was buried in an unmarked grave on the moor, one among hundreds of forgotten convicts. No family claimed him. His few belongings, a worn Bible, a pair of spectacles, and scraps of chemical notes he had scribbled in margins of prison-issued books, were destroyed by order of the warden. The case in historical perspective. Historians still debate Sparrow's legacy. Some regard him as a petty thief whose crimes were exaggerated by sensationalist newspapers. They argue the deaths of Foster and Watson may have been natural illnesses, and that Sparrow was condemned more for his eccentricity and his ominous interest in poisons than for proven murder. Others see him as a genuine pioneer of criminal method, a man who understood, long before modern bioterrorism, how to weaponize trust in systems and exploit the invisibility of ordinary mediums like letters. They point to his notebook of chemical formulas and his chilling remarks as evidence of intent that went far beyond theft. Whichever view is taken, the impact is undeniable. For decades after Sparrow's downfall, the phrase "poison in the post" lingered as shorthand for hidden danger. The quiet London clerk became a symbol of how vulnerability could nestle within the very systems designed to protect society. Reflection: Edward Sparrow never achieved notoriety on the scale of Jack the Ripper or other Victorian criminals, yet his story is, in its way, more unsettling. He was not a monster lurking in alleys, but a man behind a desk, a clerk in a trusted institution. His crime was not spectacular violence but slow corrosion of health, of trust, of the invisible bonds that held society together. And perhaps that is why his tale endures. It is easy to guard against monsters we can see. It is harder to guard against the quiet man who files papers, handles letters, and slips poison where no one thinks to look. Story 3: The Great Sausage Scandal of Chicago. In the late 19th century, Chicago was a city of meat. From the sprawling stockyards to the countless butcher shops that lined immigrant neighborhoods, the smell of blood, fat, and smoke hung permanently in the air. The city fed not only itself but the nation. Meatpacking defined Chicago's identity, and within this empire of flesh, small butchers carved out their livelihoods. One of these was Adolf Lutcher, a German immigrant who arrived in the United States in the 1860s. He was not unlike many of his countrymen, hardworking, ambitious, eager to find his footing in a city where German voices filled beer halls and Lutheran hymns echoed through neighborhood churches. But Lutcher, unlike most, would become infamous. His name would be tied not to prosperity, but to one of Chicago's most scandalous crimes: the murder of his wife and the horrifying suspicion that her remains were disposed of in sausage vats. The rise of a butcher. Lutcher began modestly, first working in tanneries before saving enough to open a small butcher's shop on Maxwell Street. By the 1890s, he had risen to prominence. He owned a factory, the A. Lutcher Sausage and Packing Company, and employed dozens of men. His sausages were popular, his reputation respectable. In an immigrant city where hard work was prized, Lutcher seemed to embody the American dream. But beneath the surface, his life was fraying. Business debts mounted. Competition from larger meatpackers cut into profits. At home, his marriage to Louisa Lutcher was troubled. Neighbors whispered of frequent quarrels. Louisa, they said, was spirited, outspoken, and weary of her husband's temper. He, in turn, resented her independence. Their disputes became public, loud enough for neighbors to overhear through thin walls. The disappearance of Louisa. On May 1, 1897, Louisa vanished. According to Lutcher, she had stormed out after an argument, vowing never to return. He told neighbors and relatives she had left him, perhaps gone to stay with her sister. At first, the claim seemed plausible. Domestic quarrels were common, and women did sometimes leave unhappy homes. But suspicion grew. Louisa had left behind her personal belongings, clothing, jewelry, even her cherished family photographs. She had not withdrawn money from the bank. Her children remained at home, bewildered. For a woman known to be devoted to her sons, her sudden abandonment rang false. When Louisa's family pressed Adolf for answers, his responses were evasive. One day he claimed she had gone to Milwaukee, another that she had traveled east. His stories shifted with each retelling. Soon, whispers spread through the German community. Louisa had not left, she had been silenced. A factory with secrets. Attention turned to the Lutcher Sausage Factory. Night watchmen recalled seeing Adolf in the building late on May 1, long after workers had gone home. They noted he was stoking the fires beneath one of the large rendering vats used for boiling meat and fat. When questioned, Luchert said he was preparing a batch of soap grease, an occasional byproduct of sausage making. But in the days that followed, workers noticed something odd. The vats had been scrubbed unusually clean. A strange odor lingered, acrid, chemical, unlike the usual smell of boiling meat. And among the ashes of the furnace, small bones were discovered. At first, no one dared suggest what those bones might mean. But rumors spread quickly. Adolf Luchert had murdered his wife and disposed of her body in his sausage factory. Police intervention. On May 15, after Louisa had been missing for 2 weeks, police finally intervened. Detectives searched the factory. In the vats they found greasy scum, bone fragments, and what appeared to be a woman's ring, its gold band warped by heat. Tests revealed the bones were consistent with human remains. The evidence was grim but circumstantial. Skeptics argued the bones could have come from animals, that the ring might have been planted. Yet the suspicion clung stubbornly. The butcher had turned murderer, and his wife had become part of his grisly industry. When Adolf was arrested, the city erupted in fascination. Newspapers dubbed it the sausage vat murder. Cartoonists sketched sausages with sinister faces. Satirical poems imagined Louisa haunting butcher shops. For a city already notorious for blood and meat, the scandal struck a nerve, the possibility that the line between food and flesh had been crossed in the most horrifying way. The trial of the century. Luchert's trial, which began in October 1897, drew packed galleries. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager for scraps of gossip. Reporters from across the country descended on Chicago, hungry for sensational details. The prosecution argued that Adolf, driven by financial ruin and marital discord, had murdered Louisa and disposed of her body in the vats. They presented the bones, the ring, and the testimony of workers who had seen him stoking fires that night. They painted him as a man who valued sausages more than his wife, whose temper had finally erupted into violence. The defense countered that Louisa was alive, that she had run away, that the bones were animal remains mistaken for human. They portrayed Adolf as a victim of rumor and prejudice, a hardworking immigrant targeted because of his German heritage and business failures. But behind the legal arguments loomed the public's imagination, inflamed by lurid headlines. Could it be true that a butcher had boiled his wife into sausages? Whether proven or not, the idea alone was enough to stain Adolf forever. The public's horrified fascination. Chicagoans flocked to butcher shops, eyeing sausages with suspicion. Some refused to eat them altogether, convinced that human flesh had entered the food supply. Satirical songs were sung in taverns, and jokes circulated in beer halls. "Be careful of your sausage, you may be eating Mrs. Luchert." The scandal was not only about murder, but about trust in food, trust in family, trust in the institutions that claimed to safeguard both. In a city built on meat, the idea that sausage could conceal a crime shook people deeply. The first verdict. The trial ended with a hung jury. Too many doubts remained: no body, no direct witness, only fragments and speculation. But the prosecution refused to relent. A second trial was scheduled for January 1898, promising to dig deeper into the mystery. For now, Adolf Luchert sat in jail, unrepentant. He insisted he was innocent, that his wife had abandoned him. Yet his silence on key details, his evasions under questioning, and his cold demeanor only deepened public suspicion. When the first jury in the Luchert case deadlocked in October 1897, it left the city in a state of uneasy fascination. For some, the lack of a conviction seemed proof of Adolf Luchert's innocence. For others, it was a frustrating pause in what they saw as an inevitable guilty verdict. Either way, the scandal only deepened. Chicagoans had tasted blood figuratively, if not literally, and they demanded resolution. Preparing for a second trial. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney Charles Denning, resolved to try again. Denning was ambitious, determined not only to convict Luchert but also to build his own political career on the back of the case. He understood that to win, he needed more than fragments of bone and a ring. He needed a narrative A story the jury could not escape. The second trial, scheduled for January 1898, promised to be even more sensational than the first. Reporters called it the sausage trial, a phrase that captured both the horror and the grotesque humor the public could not resist. Crowds once again gathered outside the Cook County Criminal Courthouse, jostling for seats. Vendors sold sausage rolls on the steps, a grim parody of the proceedings inside. The prosecution's case. This time, Denning sharpened his argument. He portrayed Adolf as a man whose financial ruin and marital discord converged in deadly fashion. His business was failing. His marriage was collapsing. He had quarreled with Louisa on the night of her disappearance. And then so the prosecution claimed he lured her into the factory, killed her, and consigned her body to the boiling vats. Experts testified to the human origin of the bones found in the furnace ash. A chemist, Professor George Dorsey of the Field Columbian Museum, identified them as belonging to a woman of Louisa's approximate size. The ring, though warped by heat, was recognized by Louisa's relatives as hers. Workers repeated their testimony about Adolf tending fires late at night, behaving oddly. Piece by piece, the prosecution assembled its mosaic of guilt. The defense fights back. Luchert's defense team, led by attorney William Vincent, attacked the case on every front. They argued that the bones were animal remains, pig or cow, not human. They mocked the chemist's expertise, suggesting that even scientists could not tell the difference between fragments of bone once reduced to ash. Most crucially, they insisted Louisa was alive. They claimed she had fled an unhappy marriage, perhaps eloping with a lover or seeking freedom beyond Chicago. Several witnesses testified to having seen a woman resembling Louisa in other cities. Though none of these sightings were confirmed, the mere possibility offered the defense a lifeline. Without a body, how could guilt be proven? The public spectacle. As testimony unfolded, Chicago reveled in the scandal. Newspapers printed daily reports, each headline more lurid than the last. "Did he boil his wife into sausages?" asked one. Illustrations showed grim-faced jurors, the sausage vats, and caricatures of Adolf himself, always depicted as hulking, brutish, and cold. Crowds outside the courthouse discussed the case as if it were theater. Butchers complained of declining sales. Sausages became the subject of nervous jokes. "Eat at your own risk," one tavern sign warned. Children dared each other to bite into sausages while chanting, "Louisa," in the links. The case, bizarre as it was, touched deep fears about trust in food, trust in family, trust in the very stability of domestic life. Testimony from the children. Perhaps the most heartbreaking moment came when the Lucherts, two young sons, Arnold and Elmer, were called to testify. Too young to grasp the full weight of the proceedings, they confirmed that their mother had not returned home after May 1, and that their father had told them she had gone away. The boys, bewildered, still seemed to hope their mother lived. Their testimony underscored the human cost of the case. Two children caught between loyalty to their father and the absence of their mother. The turn of the jury. The defense's suggestion that Louisa had fled might have held sway were it not for Adolf's own behavior. Witnesses testified to his temper, his cruelty, his threats against Louisa in the weeks before her disappearance. One neighbor recalled hearing him shout, "I will be rid of you, woman." Moreover, his demeanor in court did him no favors. He appeared sullen, indifferent, even arrogant. While the defense pleaded his case, he sometimes smirked, sometimes dozed. To jurors, it seemed the callousness of a guilty man. The evidence was still circumstantial, but the weight of suspicion grew unbearable. The verdict. On February 9, 1898, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty. Adolf Luchert was sentenced to life imprisonment. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped in horror, others in satisfaction. Outside, crowds cheered. Newspapers declared justice had been done. The Sausage King, once respected in his community, was now forever branded as a murderer. Aftermath in the city. The conviction reverberated through Chicago. Sausage sales plummeted. Butchers swore to their customers that their products were pure, free of scandal, but suspicion lingered. For months, sausages were shunned in working-class neighborhoods, replaced by other meats. The phrase "Luchert sausage" entered slang as a grim joke, used to describe anything untrustworthy or tainted. Meanwhile, the Luchert factory stood empty, a hulking reminder of crime. Children dared each other to peer through its windows at night, whispering that Lewis's ghost haunted the vats. Luchert's decline. In prison, Adolf remained defiant. He insisted he was innocent, a victim of hysteria and false science. He wrote letters protesting his conviction, blaming debtors, newspapers, and corrupt officials. But his health deteriorated. By 1899, he suffered from heart disease, worsened by prison conditions. On July 7, 1899, Adolf Luchert died in Joliet prison. His death closed the chapter, but not the questions. No full remains of Louisa were ever recovered. Her disappearance remained, in the strictest sense, unresolved. The conviction of Adolf Luchert in 1898 brought a formal end to the case, but it did not end the fascination. If anything, the story grew larger in memory than it had been in fact. The Sausage King of Chicago, as newspapers had mockingly called him, became a grotesque figure of urban folklore, a symbol of the city's anxieties about food, family, and trust at the turn of the century. A city haunted by sausages. For years after the trial, Chicagoans looked at sausages with suspicion. Sales of sausage links, once a staple of immigrant diets, plummeted. Some butchers claimed business dropped by half, particularly among families who could not shake the image of human flesh mingling with pork and beef. In taverns, songs were sung about Lewis's fate. One ballad, collected by folklorists decades later, included the haunting refrain, "Don't eat the sausage, don't sip the stew, for Lewis is gone and no one knew." Children played games in which one would pretend to be the sausage man, chasing others with mock threats of boiling them in vats. For the immigrant families of Chicago, the Luchert case became more than a crime. It was a cultural parable of mistrust. The problem of proof. Historians who revisited the trial often debated whether justice had truly been served. The evidence remained circumstantial: bone fragments, a ring, testimony of quarrels. There was no body, no direct witness, no confession. Professor George Dorsey's testimony about the human origin of the bones was pioneering but controversial. Forensic anthropology was in its infancy, and critics argued that distinguishing human from animal bones at such a fragmentary level was unreliable. The defense's insistence that the bones were pig remains, given the factory's purpose, was not implausible. Yet jurors had been swayed less by science than by story. The narrative of a violent husband, a missing wife, and a factory of vats was too compelling to dismiss. This left an uncomfortable question. Had Adolf been convicted because he was guilty, or because the city needed him to be guilty? Life after the trial. For Lewis's surviving family, the trial brought no closure. Without her body, there was no burial, no grave to visit. Her sister, who had testified against Adolf, kept a locket of Lewis's hair as a substitute memorial. The children, Arnold and Elmer, were left orphaned, shuttled between relatives. Their lives were marked by stigma forever known as the boys whose father had boiled their mother in sausage. The factory itself fell into disuse. Neighbors claimed it was cursed, that strange noises echoed at night. Eventually, the building was demolished, but stories lingered. Even decades later, Elderly Chicagoans recalled being warned as children not to walk too close to the sausage place after dark. The death of the Sausage King. Adolf's own death in 1899 closed the case formally, but it raised no sympathy. In Joliet prison, he had grown gaunt, his arrogance diminished by disease. Guards recalled him muttering about injustice, insisting his innocence until his final breath. When news of his death reached Chicago, newspapers gave it only a few lines. He was buried in an unremarkable grave, his name already synonymous with horror. The case in the public imagination. The Luchert scandal outlived its participants. In the decades that followed, the story was retold in newspapers, magazines, and even pulp novels. Each retelling embellished the details. Some claimed entire bodies had been ground into sausages, others that customers had unknowingly eaten them. In truth, there was never proof that human flesh entered Luchert's sausages. But in folklore, proof mattered less than plausibility. Chicago, a city already defined by slaughterhouses and stockyards, found in the Luchert case a story that confirmed its deepest unease, that the boundary between human and animal, between meat and murder, was disturbingly thin. Legacy and food safety. Beyond folklore, the case contributed to growing concerns about food safety. Though Upton Sinclair's The Jungle would not appear until 1906, the Luchert case foreshadowed public fears about what went unseen in the meat industry. It was cited in debates about inspection laws, with reformers arguing that if a man could dispose of his wife in a sausage factory, then surely anything could enter the food supply. The scandal helped fuel momentum for stricter regulation, ultimately leading to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Thus, Lewis's disappearance, though never solved beyond doubt, became part of the foundation for reform. A reflection on trust. Perhaps the true horror of the Luchert case lies not in what was proven but in what was imagined. Trust is invisible, trust in a spouse, trust in food, trust in the systems that sustain daily life. Adolf Luchert shattered all three at once. He was a husband accused of betraying his wife, a butcher accused of betraying his customers, and a businessman accused of betraying his community. Whether guilty beyond doubt or not, the perception of his guilt was enough to leave scars. Closing thought. In the end, we are left with a question that still hangs in the air. Was Louisa Luchert truly boiled into sausages? Or was she simply lost to history, her fate twisted into legend by a city that thrived on both meat and myth? Her absence remains the only certainty. And in that absence, imagination filled the void with fear, with rumor, with stories still whispered more than a century later. Story 4. The Curious Case of the Missing Bell Foundry. There is a peculiar kind of silence that unsettles the human mind, not the silence of night, nor the hush of an empty church, but the absence of a sound that should be there. In 1896, the small town of Loughborough in Leicestershire awoke one spring morning to such a silence. The church bells, which for centuries had tolled the hours, marked births, mourned deaths, and called the faithful to worship, were suddenly gone. Not just one, but all of them. An entire bell foundry, the John Taylor Bell Founders, Yard A site known for crafting some of the finest bells in Britain, had been robbed overnight. Its store of newly cast bronze bells, weighing several tons each, had simply disappeared. How does one steal a bell, let alone several, and where could they be hidden? These were the questions that baffled not only the townsfolk but investigators who soon descended upon the foundry, staring in disbelief at the empty yard where bells had stood only the day before. The value of bells. To understand the crime, you must picture the role bells played in 19th-century Britain. They were not only instruments of sound but also symbols of identity. A church's bells were its voice. They announced weddings, warned of fires, marked time for laborers in the fields. To silence them was to mute a community itself. Beyond their symbolic value, bells were financially precious. Cast in bronze and alloy of copper and tin, they were worth a fortune in raw material alone. A single church bell could weigh over half a ton, commanding hundreds of pounds in value. A set of 6 or 8, newly forged, represented years of wages for ordinary workers. The Loughborough foundry, already centuries old, had produced bells for churches across Britain and even overseas. Its reputation was impeccable, which made the robbery all the more shocking. The night of the theft. On the evening of May 14, the foundry foreman locked up as usual. The bells, newly cast for delivery to a church in Devon, stood in the yard, waiting for transport. Guards were posted at the gates, but no one reported disturbances. Yet by dawn, the bells were gone. The thieves had not only stolen massive objects of metal, but done so with extraordinary speed and stealth. Investigators found wheel tracks leading away from the foundry, suggesting carts or wagons had been used. But how had such heavy loads been moved without rousing suspicion? The nearest rail station had no record of unusual freight. Farmers along country roads reported no unusual convoys. It was as though the bells had evaporated overnight. First suspicions. At first, suspicion fell on rival foundries. Competition among bell makers was fierce, and jealousies ran deep. Some whispered that competitors might have hired thieves to cripple Taylor's business, but rivals denied involvement, and investigators found no evidence linking them to the crime. Attention then turned inward to the foundry's own workers. Could discontented employees have orchestrated the theft? The foundry had recently reduced wages, sparking quiet grumbling. Yet stealing entire bells required not only strength but planning, wagons, and knowledge of metallurgy. Few workers had such resources. Still, a handful were questioned. One, a disgruntled molder dismissed weeks earlier, was rumored to have ties to scrap dealers in Birmingham, but no charges were brought. The black market for bells. The investigation revealed a darker truth. There was indeed a black market for church bells. Scrap dealers melted them down into ingots of copper and tin, which could be sold anonymously. To a thief, the bell's artistry meant nothing, only the metal mattered. Authorities began checking foundries and scrap yards across the Midlands. In one Birmingham yard, investigators discovered unusual ingots, their copper-to-tin ratio matching bell bronze. But the dealer swore he had purchased them legally, from traveling men who offered no names. Without proof, the trail grew cold. A community in shock. Meanwhile, Loughborough reeled. Newspapers dubbed it the Great Bell Robbery. Parishioners wrote angry letters demanding justice. Priests lamented that weddings and funerals passed without the traditional peal. Townsfolk gathered in silence on Sundays, staring up at empty towers. One elderly woman was quoted in the Leicester Chronicle. "It is as though our town has been robbed not of bells, but of its very heart." Rumors flourished. Some claimed gypsies had taken the bells. Others swore they heard carts rumbling through the night. Children whispered that the devil himself had carried them off, resentful of their holy sound. The investigation stalls. By midsummer, despite national attention, the case faltered. No bells were recovered. No thieves were charged. The foundry replaced its losses at great expense, but the mystery lingered. How had such heavy, cumbersome objects vanished so completely? Some officials believed the theft was an inside job, that workers helped load the bells and sold them piecemeal to scrap dealers. Others suspected a traveling gang of thieves, skilled in dismantling and moving large goods. But without evidence, these remained theories. The bells were gone, melted perhaps, their sound silenced forever. By the summer of 1896, the Great Bell Robbery had grown from a curious local scandal into a matter of national embarrassment. The John Taylor Bellfounder's Yard was one of the most respected institutions in England. For centuries, its bells had been trusted to crown ceremonies, call worshippers, and mark history itself. To have them vanish silently, overnight made not only the town of Loughborough but the country itself appear foolish. Following the wagons, detectives first focused on the wheel tracks found outside the foundry. Heavy wagons had clearly carried the bells away. But whose wagons? They canvassed local stables and carters, asking who had rented horses and carts on the night in question. A few suspicious hires turned up. A team of dray horses rented in Leicester, another from a stable in Nottingham. Yet the renters had given false names and vanished without trace. The stable boys could only describe them vaguely rough men, with accents not from here. It suggested an organized gang, outsiders who had moved in deliberately. But such gangs needed buyers, and that meant finding the black market. Into the scrap yards. Scrap metal was big business in 19th-century Britain. Birmingham, Manchester, and London all hosted vast yards where copper, tin, and bronze changed hands with little paperwork. Once melted into ingots, the origin of metal was impossible to prove. Inspectors fanned out across the Midlands. In Birmingham, one dealer admitted to purchasing odd lumps of bronze from itinerant men who arrived with horse-drawn carts. The bronze was unusual dense, with a bright ring when struck, but he asked no questions. By the time investigators arrived, the bronze had been smelted down and sold on to foundries that used it for fittings and fixtures. Other dealers, when questioned, became defensive. "We buy what's offered," one snapped. "Metal has no name on it." The trail dissolved as easily as molten bronze poured into molds. The inside job theory. While police chased leads in the cities, suspicion in Loughborough turned inward. The Belfoundry's own workers knew the schedule of casts, the security arrangements, the layout of the yard. Without that knowledge, could outsiders have removed massive bells without detection? The foreman insisted his men were loyal, but detectives noted several had reason for grievance. Wages had been cut earlier that year, and rumors spread that some workers had spoken of getting even. One dismissed molder, Thomas Whitaker, came under particular suspicion. He was known to drink heavily and consort with scrap dealers in Birmingham. Witnesses swore they saw him in town the morning after the theft, flush with money. Yet no evidence tied him directly to the crime. Whitaker denied involvement, saying only, "I'd never raise a hand against the bells. They're the pride of the town." Still, many locals whispered that Whitaker had been the key guiding outsiders into the yard, showing them which bells to take. The silence of the town. As the investigation dragged on, the absence of bells grew more painful. Sundays felt incomplete without their peal. Weddings were subdued, funerals oddly flat. Townsfolk said the silence itself became accusatory, as though the community were being punished. The Leicester Chronicle wrote, "There is no sound more sorrowful than that which is missing. The bells that once rang so proudly now toll only in memory." Theories abounded. Children whispered that the bells had been spirited away by gypsies. Farmers claimed they heard wagons clattering at midnight. One woman swore she dreamt of the bells being dragged into the river by ghostly hands. Fact and rumor blurred. A lead in London. In October 1896, a breakthrough seemed possible. A London scrap merchant reported being offered church bells, whole and uncut, by a group of men who refused to give names. Suspicious, he refused the deal, but he later saw newspaper reports of the Loughborough robbery and contacted police. Unfortunately, he had little to offer. No names, no exact location, only the vague impression that the men were foreigners, perhaps Irish or German. Still, it suggested the bells, or at least some of them, had reached London. But once again, the trail went cold. No bells were recovered. A new angle, the railways. Detectives revisited the problem of transport. If the bells had not traveled entirely by cart, perhaps they had been smuggled onto trains. The Midland Railway ran freight lines directly through the region. Could the thieves have bribed porters to load the bells at night, disguising them as legitimate cargo. Inquiries at depots turned up little. Records showed no unusual shipments, yet railway men admitted it was possible for goods to be moved off the books with bribes. A single night watchman looking the other way could make all the difference. If true, it meant the bells might have left Loughborough by rail, scattered across England within hours. The stigma of betrayal. By year's end, the investigation had stalled. No arrests, no recoveries. The bells were presumed melted, their sound lost forever. But the town did not forget. For years afterward, suspicion clung to the foundry's workers. Neighbors eyed them warily, asking who among them had betrayed the community. Families of workers swore their innocence, but gossip persisted. Children taunted the sons of suspected men with cries of "bell thief." It was not only the bells that were stolen, but trust itself. The press turns the story. National newspapers eventually lost interest, but penny weeklies and sensational broadsheets transformed the robbery into legend. Some claimed the bells had been sold overseas, ringing now in America or India. Others imagined them hidden in barns, awaiting discovery. One cartoon depicted the devil himself hauling bells into a fiery pit, grinning as Loughborough priests wept. Another story suggested rival bell makers had melted the bronze and recast it into their own commissions, forever silencing Taylor's craftsmanship. The truth was far less dramatic but far more frustrating. The bells had vanished into the anonymous economy of scrap metal. By early 1897, the Great Bell robbery had slipped from the headlines, but for the people of Loughborough, the silence remained. The bells were not returned, no culprits were ever convicted, and the case quietly entered the long catalogue of unsolved Victorian crimes. Yet its impact stretched beyond the immediate loss. The theft of something so heavy, so symbolic, forced Britain to rethink not just security, but also the fragility of the institutions it trusted. A town that rebuilt its voice. The John Taylor Bell Founders Company eventually replaced the stolen bells, at great cost. New molds were poured, fresh bronze melted, and by the end of the year, the towers that had fallen silent once again rang with sound. Parishioners wept when the first peal echoed across Loughborough, not only from joy but from relief. But something had changed. The bells no longer carried only their sacred associations of weddings and funerals. They also carried memory of betrayal, the shadow of theft. When villagers heard them, they also remembered the months of eerie silence when their community's voice had been stolen. Security and industry lessons. The robbery forced foundries across Britain to strengthen their defenses. Where once the sheer size and weight of bells had been considered their own protection, companies now realized thieves could move almost anything with enough planning. Tailors added guards, improved locks, and insisted on quicker transportation from foundry to church. Other bell makers followed suit. The case was even cited in trade journals as proof that no object is too heavy for theft if profit lies in its metal. The lesson extended beyond bells. Factories producing large metal goods anchors, engines, even railway parts began taking greater precautions. Security, once an afterthought, became a cost of doing business. The human toll. For the workers of the Loughborough foundry, suspicion never entirely faded. Even as new bells rang, whispers lingered. Who had betrayed them? Was it one of their own who had shown the thieves how to move such cumbersome weights? Families bore the stigma for years. Children of suspected workers were teased in schools. Some men moved away to escape the rumors. Even those entirely innocent carried the weight of community doubt. The foreman who had locked the gates that night never forgave himself. Though no evidence suggested he was negligent, he later said, "It was my hand that turned the key, yet I might as well have left the door wide." He died convinced he had failed his town. Theories that refused to die. With no resolution, the robbery bred theories. The inside job. Many believed dismissed workers, still bitter from wage cuts, had led outsiders into the yard. The skill and knowledge required seemed too precise for strangers. The traveling gang. Others pointed to organized thieves who roamed the Midlands, stealing horses, tools, and now, perhaps, bells. Such gangs could disappear into the anonymity of industrial cities. The rivalry plot. A smaller faction insisted rival foundries orchestrated the theft, hoping to damage Taylor's reputation. Though evidence was lacking, the idea lingered in trade gossip. The overseas shipment. Some stories claim the bells had been shipped abroad whole, adorning churches in America or the colonies. Bell enthusiasts searched overseas registers for years but found nothing. None of these theories could be proven. The bronze had either been melted or vanished into legend. Memory and myth. By the early 20th century, the case had entered folklore. In pubs, locals told it as a cautionary tale, how silence can fall without warning, how even the heaviest things can be stolen. Children were warned not to stay out late, lest the bell thieves take you too. In newspapers, the story resurfaced whenever another large theft occurred. Comparisons were made to stolen statues, anchors, even railway bridges. The missing bells of Loughborough became shorthand for boldness in crime. For some, the crime took on supernatural color. Parishioners swore they heard phantom peals on windless nights. Others claimed dreams of bells tolling underwater, as though the thieves had dumped them in rivers. Skeptics scoffed, but the stories kept memory alive. Broader implications. The case also highlighted a paradox of Victorian progress. The very industrial advances that allowed Britain to build vast factories, powerful machines, and massive infrastructure also made crime on an unprecedented scale possible. Heavy loads no longer guaranteed safety. Carts, railways, and organized gangs could move mountains of metal. The Great Bell Robbery was not just about stolen bronze. It was about the vulnerability of modern society, how even the most sacred objects could be reduced to scrap by greed. Reflection. What remains most haunting is not what was lost, but what was never explained. Bells weighing tons cannot simply vanish without trace, and yet they did. No names, no arrests, no confessions. Just silence, then rumor, then replacement. It forces a question that lingers even today. How much of what we believe secure is only secure because no one has yet dared to take it? Closing thought. The bells of Loughborough eventually rang again, their voices restored. But the originals, the ones stolen in the night, never returned. Whether melted, sold, or hidden, their silence remains. And in that silence lies a lesson, that even the heaviest objects can be stolen, but the weight of mystery endures far longer than metal. Story 5. The Farmer Who Sold the Same Cow Twice. In the autumn of 1874, in a small rural town in Dorset, England, a peculiar scandal unfolded, one that, at first glance, might seem almost comical compared to murders or daring robberies. Yet for those involved, it was ruinous, and for historians of crime, it remains a perfect study in deception, trust, and the limits of law in rural Victorian life. The case concerned a farmer named Thomas Briggs, a man of middling means and unremarkable character. He owned a few cows, some pigs, and a modest patch of land outside the town of Sherborne. Neighbors described him as genial but shrewd, always with an eye for a bargain. He was neither wealthy nor destitute, and like many small farmers of the era, he survived on slim margins. On a chilly market morning in November, Briggs arrived at the Sherborne Livestock Fair leading a plump brown cow. By midday, the cow had been sold to a butcher for a respectable sum. Nothing unusual until, by the end of the same day, Briggs was seen selling what appeared to be the very same cow again, this time to a neighboring farmer. How could a man sell the same cow twice in one day without being caught instantly? And how did such a petty-looking swindle spiral into one of the region's strangest court cases? Livestock as currency. To understand the crime, you must first appreciate the value of a cow in Victorian England. For small farmers, livestock was not merely food or milk, but a form of currency. Cows could be traded, used to pay debts, or sold to cover expenses. A strong, healthy animal could fetch a price equivalent to several months' wages for a laborer. Transactions at markets were swift and often based on trust. Men shook hands to seal deals, sometimes with little paperwork. Money exchanged hands, beasts were tagged, and drovers moved them to pens or drove them home along country roads. That very trust was what Thomas Briggs exploited. The first sale. According to court records, Briggs's cow, a glossy brown heifer, fattened for the winter, was sold first to Mr. Howard, a butcher from Yeovil. Witnesses saw Briggs lead the animal into Howard's pen after the sale was struck for £12, a fair price. Howard paid Briggs in cash and told him he would collect the animal the following morning, as was customary. Satisfied, Briggs pocketed the money and left the market. But instead of heading home, he circled back. By evening, as the fair began to quiet, he reappeared, this time leading a very familiar-looking cow once again by a rope. The second sale. The second buyer was a local farmer named William Phelps, who had long admired Briggs's livestock. Seeing the heifer, Phelps struck a deal almost immediately. Briggs claimed he had another cow of the same sort and could part with it for £11. Phelps paid him, and Briggs once again walked away with a pocket full of cash. Only the next day, when both buyers came to collect their purchase, did the trick reveal itself. There was only one cow. Howard insisted it was his. Phelps insisted likewise. Briggs had disappeared. A town in uproar. News spread quickly. Sherborne was no London. It was a place where everyone knew each other's business. Farmers were incensed, not just at Briggs, but at the idea that such a simple con could undermine trust at the market. If one man could sell the same cow twice, what faith could anyone have in their handshakes and deals? Howard, the butcher, immediately lodged a complaint with the constable, and soon Phelps followed. Within days, Briggs was apprehended at a cousin's farm 2 villages away, still carrying some of the money from both sales. The court proceedings. At the assizes, the case was presented with unusual gravity for what, on the surface, was a livestock dispute. The prosecution argued that Briggs had deliberately staged the double sale, moving the cow back and forth to make it appear as though there were 2 animals. The defense, however, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that Briggs believed he was selling one heifer to Howard and another similar heifer to Phelps. The jury did not believe him. Still, questions lingered. How exactly had Briggs moved the cow unnoticed? Had anyone helped him? And most curiously, why risk such a brazen fraud for a few pounds, when discovery was almost inevitable? The social consequences. For rural Dorset, the case struck a deeper chord. It was not merely about theft, but about betrayal of community trust. Markets operated on reputation. A man caught cheating could never expect to trade fairly again. For Briggs, the sentence was harsh, 2 years of hard labor. But for Sherborne, the real punishment was the shadow of suspicion that now hung over every market sale. Farmers began insisting on written receipts. Butchers demanded immediate delivery. An old tradition of trust had been broken by one man's deception. When Thomas Briggs stood before the assize court in Dorchester, many in the gallery struggled to understand what had driven him to such a reckless scheme. He was not a notorious criminal, nor was he known for violence or drunkenness. On the contrary, most recalled him as a fairly typical Dorset farmer, sometimes cheerful, sometimes sour, always scraping by like the rest of them. So why risk prison for the price of a cow? The answer lay in the hidden world of rural debt, a world that, in the 1870s, pressed heavily upon smallholders across England. The burden of the small farmer. To be a farmer in Dorset in the mid-19th century was to live perpetually on the edge of solvency. The agricultural depression of the 1870s was beginning to bite, caused by cheap imports of grain and meat from America and the colonies. Prices were falling, but rents remained stubbornly high. Briggs leased his small farm from a local landowner, Sir Henry Lacy. Rent was due quarterly, and by the autumn of 1874, Briggs was several months behind. On top of that, he owed money to a seed merchant, a farrier, and even his local pub landlord. Each debt by itself might have been manageable, but combined, they threatened to swallow him whole. Neighbors later testified that Briggs had spoken openly of his struggles. A man may till and sweat, yet never see the color of his own coin. The temptation of quick money. In this climate, the cow in question represented not just livestock but liquidity. A single sale could clear a debt or buy seed for next year's harvest. Yet to Briggs, one sale wasn't enough. He needed more than one buyer. And so, standing in the crowded Sherborne market, pockets empty and creditors looming, Briggs conceived his gamble. Sell the same cow twice, collect double the cash, and use the money to pay off his most pressing debts. Perhaps, he thought, he could make things right before anyone noticed. It was a foolish hope, but desperation breeds poor judgment. How he pulled it off. Investigators pieced together the method Briggs used that day. After selling the cow first to Mr. Howard, the butcher, Briggs dutifully led the animal into Howard's pen. But instead of leaving it tied, he lingered nearby until Howard moved on to inspect other beasts. At that moment, Briggs quietly slipped the cow back out, claiming he was taking it for water. A common enough act livestock often needed to be walked. He led the animal around the back of the pens, where he concealed it among other cattle temporarily unsupervised. Later, he reintroduced the same cow as if it were a fresh arrival, offering it to William Phelps. In the bustle of the market, with animals constantly shifting, no one noticed. Rural fraud in context. As brazen as it was, Briggs's scam was not unique in its era. The 19th century teemed with quiet crimes in the countryside, subtle frauds, forged receipts, diluted milk, watered-down ale, and dishonest waits at mills. Livestock fraud was particularly common. Farmers sometimes painted over brands, swapped animals at night, or claimed to sell one beast while delivering another. The trust-based economy made such schemes possible. Briggs's crime was unusual only in its clumsiness. To sell the exact same cow twice, in the same market within hours of each other, was bound to unravel. Community outrage. What shocked Sherborne was not merely that Briggs tried it, but that he seemed to think he might succeed. To the townsfolk, his act suggested either arrogance or despair. At trial, witnesses described the uproar the next morning when both buyers arrived. Howard the butcher shouted that he had paid in full. Phelps swore just as loudly. Market officials had to intervene as tempers flared. The cow stood dumbly between them, oblivious to the storm. Briggs himself was nowhere to be found. By the time constables caught him, he had spent part of the money paying his seed debt and a portion of his rent. In his pocket, however, they found a small sum remaining, proof he had not fled for good. The court's view. The judge at Dorchester Assizes was stern. He reminded the jury that livestock markets depended entirely on trust. To undermine that was to strike at the foundation of rural trade. If such frauds are permitted, he warned, no man will dare to deal in open market without suspicion of his neighbor. The jury needed little convincing. Briggs was convicted of obtaining money by false pretenses, a serious offense in Victorian law. The man behind the crime. Yet not all saw Briggs as a hardened fraudster. Some locals described him as more foolish than wicked, a man crushed by debt, who grasped at a dishonest chance to set himself free. His wife testified in his defense, describing their children's hunger and their bare cupboards. She wept as she told the court, he thought to mend matters, not worsen them. The press, however, had little sympathy. The Sherborne Mercury ran with the headline, Cow twice sold farmers double dealing exposed. London papers picked it up, mocking Briggs as a rustic swindler and comparing his trick to children playing games. Larger lessons. The case revealed something deeper about rural England, that behind the pastoral calm lay immense pressure. Farmers who could not compete with industrialized agriculture sometimes resorted to small acts of deception, bending rules in the hope of survival. Briggs's mistake was not in being dishonest. Dishonesty was common, but in being too bold, too obvious. His punishment of 2 years' hard labor was meant to serve as a warning. Yet to his neighbors, it was also a tragedy. Here was a man they knew, who had shared their fields and fairs, now condemned to a prison quarry, breaking stones for a crime that, though foolish, was not violent. When the gavel fell in the Dorchester Assizes courtroom and Thomas Briggs was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, a hush fell over the spectators. Some nodded grimly, satisfied that justice had been done. Others shook their heads, muttering that the punishment seemed cruel for a man who had harmed no one physically. Regardless of opinion, Briggs was led away in irons, his fate sealed by the weight of Victorian justice. But the story of Briggs and the cow he sold twice did not end with his conviction. The case rippled outward, shaping not only his own life and family, but also how rural markets in England were conducted in the years that followed. Life in prison. Hard labor in the 1870s was no idle phrase. Briggs was sent to Portland Prison, a notorious site perched on the Dorset coast where convicts were tasked with breaking stone from the island's quarries. Prisoners toiled in gangs, cutting blocks for railways and naval fortifications. Days began before dawn, and work continued until dusk, with meager meals and iron discipline in between. For a farmer used to working fields and animals, quarry labor was punishing. Records note that Briggs's health declined quickly. He suffered from chest pains, likely from the dust, and grew thin. His letters to his wife, preserved in fragments, reveal a man both regretful and bewildered. "I meant to mend our matters, Mary, not to come to this. Tell the children I think of them each morning when the horn blows us to work." He never denied his crime, but he seemed to insist, again and again, that he had not meant it as wickedness so much as necessity. The family left behind. At home, Mary Briggs bore the brunt of her husband's downfall. With Thomas in prison, she was left to tend the farm with her eldest son, barely 15. They sold 2 pigs to cover part of the rent and took in laundry from wealthier families in town. Neighbors occasionally lent help, but stigma clung to them. Children at school taunted the Briggs youngsters as calf stealers or cow cheats. Mary endured whispers in the market when she came to buy grain or flour. Though some sympathized, others saw her family as tainted by Thomas's act. Rural communities could be both close-knit and merciless. The community response. Among farmers in Sherborne and surrounding villages, the incident became a cautionary tale. Market men spoke of it for years. "Mind you don't get Briggsed," they warned, meaning cheated by a double sale or false promise. To prevent similar frauds, market officials introduced new practices. Tags and chalk marks became mandatory for animals upon sale, and drovers were required to oversee transfers immediately. What had once been an informal process, sealed with a handshake, now required oversight. Briggs, in effect, forced modernization upon the market, though few would have thanked him for it. The press and public perception. The newspapers loved the case. Urban readers far removed from cows and markets treated the story as rustic comedy. Punch magazine ran a cartoon of a farmer holding 2 ropes, both tied to the same cow, while 2 buyers pulled at either end. The caption read, "A bargain doubled." But beneath the satire was a harsher reality. The rural poor were often mocked for their supposed ignorance or trickery, and Briggs became a symbol of both. His name was dragged into jokes for years after, ensuring that even long after his release, he could never fully escape the shame. Release and aftermath. Briggs served his full term and was released in 1876. By then, he was a man aged beyond his years. Neighbors described him as gaunt, with stooped shoulders and a haunted expression. He returned to his family, but the farm was gone seized by his landlord for arrears. The Briggs family now lived in a rented cottage on the edge of town, surviving on day labor and odd jobs. Though some neighbors forgave him, many did not. He was rarely welcomed at market again, and buyers were reluctant to deal with him. In time, he gave up farming altogether and took work as a laborer on road crews. In his later years, Briggs reportedly avoided speaking of the cow affair. When pressed, he would mutter only, "It was my folly." Broader impact. While Briggs faded into obscurity, his crime lived on in local memory. For decades, farmers recalled the scandal whenever disputes arose over livestock sales. Market officials cited it as justification for stricter rules. In a sense, Briggs's folly became part of the region's unwritten law, a reminder that trust, once broken, must be guarded with procedures. More broadly, his story illustrates how even small crimes could shake rural economies. A cow sold twice may seem trivial compared to great robberies or murders, but in a village where everyone knew each other, it was seismic. The fraud called into question the entire fabric of exchange, undermining centuries of custom. Reflections on justice. Looking back, historians debate whether Briggs's punishment fit the crime. 2 years of hard labor was severe for what amounted to a con worth £12. Yet in the logic of Victorian justice, symbolic crimes required symbolic punishments. Briggs was not merely a thief. He was, in the eyes of the law, a betrayer of trust. And trust was the foundation of England's markets from Sherborne to London. To let him off lightly would have set a dangerous precedent. Still, one wonders, did prison reform him or simply destroy him? A thought to end on. Thomas Briggs's story is not of murder nor high drama, but of something quieter, the peril of trust in a fragile economy. One cow, 2 buyers, and a desperate farmer were enough to upend a community's faith in its own traditions. And so we are left with a question. Was Briggs a villain who corrupted the market, or a casualty of an unforgiving system that left men like him with too few choices? Story 6. The Apothecary's Poisoned Sweets. On a spring afternoon in 1858 in the bustling industrial town of Bradford, England, children crowded outside a small sweet shop. The shop's display window gleamed with bright jars of humbugs, lozenges, and barley sugar. For working families whose lives were filled with soot, smoke, and factory labor, sweets were an affordable luxury, a few pennies worth of escape. That day, a batch of peppermint humbugs striped black and white, sticky and fragrant, were in high demand. Mothers bought them as small rewards for children, and laborers took them as cheap comforts for long shifts. None could have known that inside those sweets lay not sugar but death. Within hours, dozens of people would be seized with stomach cramps, vomiting, and collapse. By nightfall, 20 would be dead, and more than 200 gravely ill. The culprit was not a deliberate poisoner in the mold of a murderer, but something at once more ordinary and more shocking, a mixture-up of chemicals in a local apothecary's storeroom. This, then, is the story of the Bradford sweets, poisoning, a tragedy of negligence, profit, and the perilous intersections of medicine and food in Victorian England. The culture of sweets. To grasp the full horror, you must first imagine the setting. By the mid-19th century, sweets had become a booming trade. Sugar imports from the Caribbean were abundant, and small shops sold boiled sweets in every town. They were not just for children, but for all classes. A pennyworth of humbugs or drops could lift spirits in a grim industrial landscape. But sweets were also notoriously adulterated. Makers often used cheap fillers to stretch sugar stocks, chalk, plaster, and even powdered stone. The practice was so common that most consumers expected a little impurity. Profit margins were slim, and shopkeepers did what they must to survive. Yet in Bradford, what was meant as a small fraud became a catastrophe. The chain of events. The disaster began at a druggist's shop owned by a man named Charles Hodgson. Hodgson supplied local tradesmen, including confectioners, with materials such as powdered sugar, peppermint oil, and other chemicals. On October 30, 1858, a sweetmaker named Joseph Neal sent his apprentice to Hodgson's shop to collect a supply of powdered sugar called daff, in local slang for his peppermint humbugs. Hodgson was unwell, so he directed his assistant to fetch the sugar from the storeroom. But here lay the fatal mistake. In a dimly lit corner of the shop stood a barrel not of sugar, but of arsenic trioxide, a white powder nearly identical in appearance. By error, the assistant scooped up 12 pounds of arsenic and delivered it to Neal's apprentice. Neal's workshop boiled the sugar with peppermint oil, poured the mixture into molds, and produced hundreds of humbugs. The sweets went on sale that very afternoon. The victims. By evening, the consequences were horrifying. Those who ate the humbugs began to complain of sharp stomach pains, nausea, and dizziness. Families thought at first it was food poisoning or a stomach bug, but symptoms worsened rapidly: violent vomiting, muscle spasms, and collapse. One of the first victims was a young boy who had eaten just a few humbugs. He died within hours. Soon, entire households that had shared the sweets were struck down. Doctors were baffled until one physician, examining the vomit of a patient, detected a faint odor of garlic, a telltale sign of arsenic. By nightfall, panic spread. Police traced the sweets back to Neal's shop, and samples were rushed to a chemist for testing. The result was undeniable. The humbugs contained lethal amounts of arsenic. Public outrage. The scale of the disaster stunned the nation. 20 people were confirmed dead, among them children as young as 5. Over 200 more were left seriously ill, some suffering long-term effects of arsenic poisoning. The press exploded with condemnation. How could a mistake so careless occur? Why was a deadly poison stored alongside sugar? And how could any system allow shopkeepers to stretch sugar with fillers in the first place? Victorians, already suspicious of food adulteration, now viewed sweets with dread. One newspaper thundered, "Who can trust what he eats when even the humblest sweet may prove his death?" The law's dilemma. When the case reached the courts, it revealed a gap in Victorian law. Hodgson, the druggist, had not deliberately sold arsenic. It was a mistake by his assistant. Neal, the sweetmaker, had not poisoned anyone knowingly. He had simply used what he believed to be sugar. And yet, 20 lives had been lost. The coroner's jury returned a verdict of accidental death, to the outrage of the public. No one was convicted of murder. Hodgson and Neal faced financial ruin and public scorn, but neither went to prison. The law, as it stood, had little provision for punishing negligence on this scale. Aftermath in Bradford. For years, Bradford carried the shadow of the poisoning. Families who lost children never forgot. Survivors bore lingering health problems. Sweet shops, once cheerful, became places of suspicion. But perhaps the most lasting impact was legislative. Out of the Bradford disaster came new pressure for food safety laws. The case was cited in Parliament as proof that the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act, passed earlier but weakly enforced, needed strengthening. Slowly, over the next decades, Britain developed a framework for regulating ingredients, labeling poisons, and protecting consumers. On the evening of October 30, 1858, chaos swept across Bradford. Doctors and policemen rushed from house to house, tending to dozens of stricken families. The connection between the peppermint humbugs and the sudden outbreak of illness became undeniable when nearly every household that had purchased the sweets reported the same violent symptoms. By midnight, at least a dozen were dead, and more were fighting for their lives. The investigation that followed would peel back layers of negligence, greed, and systemic failure. It was not simply about a shopkeeper's mistake. It was about an industrial society where poisons were handled as casually as flour, and where consumer protections were almost non-existent. The medical puzzle. At first, physicians were puzzled. Arsenic poisoning in medicine was not unknown. The substance was widely used in tiny doses for certain treatments, but never before had such a large group fallen ill simultaneously from sweets. Doctors observed a pattern: burning in the throat, excruciating stomach cramps, violent vomiting, followed by convulsions and collapse. In survivors, weakness and tingling of the limbs lingered for days. A local chemist, suspecting poison, tested vomit samples with the Marsh test, a relatively new forensic method that could detect arsenic in minute quantities. The result was unmistakable. Arsenic was present in lethal amounts. The scale shocked even seasoned physicians. Post-mortems revealed stomachs corroded by the poison, far beyond what might be expected from incidental contamination. Later estimates showed each sweet contained enough arsenic to kill 2 people. Tracing the supply chain. The police quickly retraced the sweets to Joseph Neal's workshop. Neal himself was horrified. He insisted he had followed his usual recipe: boiled daff, powdered sugar, peppermint oil, and coloring. His apprentice swore that he had collected the sugar that very morning from Hodgson's druggist's shop, as always. When questioned, Charles Hodgson, the apothecary, confirmed he had been unwell and had instructed his assistant, William Goddard, to supply the sugar. Goddard admitted he had gone into the storeroom, seen a barrel of white powder, and assumed it was sugar. In truth, it was arsenic trioxide, purchased for local dyers who used it in treating fabrics. Thus the fatal chain was clear: an assistant's mistake, a sweetmaker's unwitting use, and a community poisoned. The role of arsenic in Victorian life. The question naturally arose: why was so much arsenic lying around in a druggist's shop at all? The answer reveals the peculiar duality of Victorian commerce. Arsenic, though deadly, was everywhere. It was used in rat poison, in pigments for wallpapers and fabrics, in medicines, and in agricultural treatments. Entire factories produced arsenical green dyes, so fashionable that drawing rooms were often steeped in invisible toxins. Housewives purchased small amounts of arsenic as casually as flour to rid their homes of vermin. That such a deadly powder could sit in a storeroom, indistinguishable from sugar or flour, was a symptom of the era's cavalier handling of poisons. Labels were often poorly marked. Containers were reused. The law required only the vaguest precautions. The inquest. The coroner's inquest drew crowds. Families demanded justice. Yet the proceedings revealed the limitations of English law. The jury heard how Neal had no reason to suspect the powder was anything but sugar. Hodgson, though careless, had not intended harm. Goddard, the assistant, admitted his error but insisted he had been following orders and did not know the difference between sugar and arsenic. The coroner himself was visibly shaken. He concluded the deaths were caused by accidental poisoning but struggled to assign criminal intent. The final verdict: accidental death. This outraged the public. How could the loss of 20 innocent lives be brushed aside as mere misfortune? But under the law, negligence, however gross, was not easily prosecuted as manslaughter. The press response. Newspapers seized on the case. Editorials thundered that if such a disaster could happen in Bradford, it could happen anywhere. One satirical cartoon showed a family at table, a mother offering humbugs to her children with the caption, "Who wants arsenic for dessert?" Pamphlets circulated warning of the sweet death and urging families to avoid boiled sweets altogether. Shopkeepers across England saw their trade plummet. Children cried when mothers refused to buy them humbugs. For months afterward, the very sight of striped sweets made people shudder. The press demanded reform. How could poisons be sold so freely? Why were foodstuffs so often adulterated? How many other deaths had gone unnoticed because no one thought to test for toxins? Broader context: food adulteration. The Bradford case was not an isolated event. Across Victorian Britain, food adulteration was rife. Alum was added to bread to make it whiter. Red lead gave sweets a brighter color. Beer was watered down and fortified with dubious chemicals. Tea leaves were stretched with dried ash or even sheep's dung. Most of these adulterants did not kill instantly but slowly undermined health. The Bradford poisoning was exceptional only in its sudden, dramatic toll. It forced into view a problem that reformers had long complained about: the absence of effective food safety laws. Parliamentary debates. Within weeks, the tragedy was raised in Parliament. Reformers argued that without stricter regulation, such disasters would recur. They pointed out that existing laws on food adulteration were weak and rarely enforced. Poisons, they argued, should be clearly labeled, stored separately, and restricted to licensed sellers. Some members resisted, claiming new laws would burden honest tradesmen. But the public mood demanded action. Pamphlets, petitions, and protests followed. The Bradford case became a rallying cry for reformers like Dr. Arthur Hill Hassall, who had long campaigned against food adulteration. Community aftershocks. For Bradford itself, the tragedy left scars deeper than any legal ruling. Families mourned children lost for the sake of a sweet treat. Survivors bore long-lasting weakness and nerve damage. Neil's sweet shop was shuttered, its name cursed. Hodgson's druggist shop never regained trust. Neighbors whispered of divine punishment. Clergymen preached against greed, suggesting that adulteration was not merely dishonest but sinful. At funerals, mothers clutched the small coffins of their children and asked aloud how a simple sweet could be transformed into a weapon of mass death. The moral question lingered: was this truly an accident, or the predictable consequence of a society that put profit before safety? Seeds of reform. The Bradford poisoning became a turning point. Within a few years, stricter laws on food adulteration began to appear. Poisons Acts required clearer labeling and safer storage. Chemists were increasingly held responsible for distinguishing between harmless and deadly substances. And yet, reform was slow. Many of the very same problems: contamination, adulteration, corner cutting would resurface in different guises for decades. The lesson of Bradford was stark but, for some, easily forgotten. The funerals for the victims of the Bradford poisoning stretched on for days. Coffins, many heartbreakingly small, were carried through the streets by mourners who marched in stunned silence. Local papers published lists of the dead: young boys, little girls, shop clerks, a grandmother. Whole families were altered in an instant, and Bradford, a town booming with industrial optimism, found itself the focus of a national conversation about death, negligence, and responsibility. This was no ordinary accident. It was the sharpest warning yet that industrial Britain, in its hunger for profit and progress, had left its citizens vulnerable to invisible dangers. The tragedy did not vanish with the coffins. Instead, it began to reshape English law, public health, and consumer protection in ways that ripple forward even today. The question of justice. Legally, the Bradford case ended with frustration. The coroner's jury, having ruled accidental death, left the families with no sense of accountability. Joseph Neal, the sweetmaker, though devastated, was not prosecuted. Charles Hodgson, the ailing chemist, and William Goddard, his hapless assistant, faced no criminal charges. The law at the time required intent for manslaughter, and none could be proven. Hodgson had not ordered his assistant to supply poison. Goddard had not knowingly given it out. Neal had no reason to suspect his sugar was arsenic. Each man's failure was gross negligence, but negligence alone was not punishable under English law. For the grieving families, this legal gap was intolerable. How could 20 lives be lost with no one held responsible? The public anger, fanned by the press, demanded more than verdicts of accident. It demanded change. Parliamentary action. In 1858, the very year of the poisoning, Parliament began to debate new measures. The catastrophe coincided with a growing reform movement led by medical men like Dr. Arthur Hill Hassall, who had already exposed widespread adulteration of food through chemical tests published in the Lancet. Hassall's earlier reports had struggled to gain traction, but now the Bradford disaster gave his campaign a tragic clarity. Reformers argued that poisons must be strictly controlled. Shops that sold them should keep records of each sale. Containers should be distinctly marked, even colored, so no assistant could mistake arsenic for sugar. Most importantly, the government must take responsibility for ensuring that what entered the mouths of its people was safe. Within a few years, the Pharmacy Act of 1868 was passed. It restricted the sale of arsenic and other poisons to registered chemists and druggists. It required labeling with the word poison, and often the addition of coloring agents to prevent accidental confusion. The Bradford deaths had at last forced Parliament to act. The long shadow of arsenic. Even after the new laws, arsenic did not vanish from British life. It remained in wallpapers, fabrics, and even medicines for decades. But the Bradford case permanently changed how the public perceived the substance. What had once been a common household item now carried an aura of dread. Mothers whispered to their children, "Don't eat strange sweets. You never know what they might contain." Shopkeepers, once careless, began to scrutinize their supplies more carefully. Arsenic was no longer just a tool of convenience. It was a word synonymous with death. And yet, its allure lingered. In later years, arsenic became infamous not only as an accidental killer, but as a deliberate one, used by poisoners in both England and abroad. The Bradford tragedy reminded juries that sometimes the deadliest killers were not sinister individuals in the shadows, but everyday substances sitting unnoticed on a shelf. Cultural consequences. For years afterward, Bradford sweets was shorthand for danger. In ballads and rhymes, children repeated grim warnings about candy that could kill. Street vendors saw their trade collapse. Some never recovered their livelihood, even though they had no connection to the case. The psychological scar ran deep. A simple sweet had always been a symbol of childhood delight, a small indulgence in hard times. Now it became a potential weapon. That cultural unease around food and purity only intensified in the late 19th century, as reformers uncovered more adulteration scandals from milk thinned with chalk to beer strengthened with deadly additives. Bradford, unwillingly, had become the symbol of everything that could go wrong when industry met indifference. Lessons for investigators. The Bradford case also shaped early forensic science. The Marsh test, used to detect arsenic in victims, gained prominence as a reliable forensic tool. Medical officers began to call for systematic testing in suspicious deaths. Poison, once nearly invisible in the courtroom, could now be proven with chemical certainty. This case, though ruled accidental, helped set the stage for later poison prosecutions, where forensic chemistry played a central role. It underscored that the fight against crime was not only about catching culprits, but about developing the tools to see what the naked eye could not. Comparisons and echoes. Bradford was not unique. Across Europe and America, similar tragedies unfolded, often involving food adulteration. In New York, bakers were caught whitening bread with chalk. In Germany, sweets were colored with copper compounds. In Paris, wine was laced with lead. But Bradford's tragedy was unique in its scale and its drama. So many deaths, so swiftly, from something as innocent as a peppermint humbug. It became the case study reformers cited in speeches, the cautionary tale parents used at bedtime, the story that haunted shopkeepers who cut corners. Human stories of grief. Behind the reforms and headlines were real lives forever altered. Accounts survive of parents who buried two, sometimes 3 children in a single week. Survivors spoke of being unable to eat sweets for years, haunted by the memory of the burning in their throats. One father, quoted in the Leeds Mercury, said, "We bought them humbugs as a treat, and they took my lads to their graves." The grief was not only personal but communal. Churches held special services. Schools raised funds for affected families. Bradford itself became a symbol of mourning a community betrayed by its own marketplace. The broader legacy. The Bradford poisoning of 1858 is remembered today not as a curious accident, but as a turning point in public health. It stands at the crossroads between a laissez-faire economy and the beginnings of consumer protection. It forced Victorians to admit that some dangers could not be left to chance, and that the state had a duty to guard against invisible killers. Without Bradford, reform might have come decades later. Instead, the deaths of 20 innocents accelerated a movement toward regulation that still underpins our food safety systems today. Closing reflection. You might find it chilling to imagine an ordinary family walking home from a shop, a paper bag of striped humbugs in hand. A child unwraps the sweet, pops it into their mouth, and smiles only for that smile to turn into agony within hours. That simple moment, repeated across households in Bradford, reshaped how an entire nation thought about trust, commerce, and the unseen dangers in daily life. The peppermint humbugs of 1858 were not just sweets. They were a warning, written in lives lost, that safety could not be left to chance, and that even the most innocent pleasures can conceal the most devastating risks. Story 7. The Counterfeit Candle Conspiracy. Picture yourself in the dim parlor of a Victorian townhouse. Gas lamps were spreading across Britain's great cities by the mid-19th century, but for many working-class homes, the glow of a candle remained the only source of light after dusk. Candles meant more than illumination. They symbolized domestic order, warmth, and continuity in a world that was changing at dizzying speed. Yet beneath their calm flicker, a quiet criminal industry thrived, one that transformed this household staple into a vehicle for fraud, deception, and even danger. The so-called counterfeit candle conspiracy was not a single crime in the dramatic sense of a bank robbery or murder. Instead, it was a series of intertwined frauds, supply chain deceptions, and fraudulent substitutions that spread across England in the mid-1800s. Its victims were not wealthy merchants or political elites, but the ordinary people who trusted that the candles they purchased to light their homes would burn as promised. This was the story of how unscrupulous chandlers, wholesalers, and backroom experimenters turned necessity into opportunity, exploiting the vulnerable balance between supply, demand, and ignorance in an age when food and household goods were only just beginning to be regulated. The candle trade in transition. For centuries, the candle trade had been straightforward. Beeswax candles, pure and golden, were the most desired, their flame steady, their scent sweet. But beeswax was expensive, and by the 18th century, few but the wealthy could afford them. The poor relied on tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, which smoked, sputtered, and gave off a sour odor. In the early 19th century, new materials changed everything. Stearin, derived from animal fat, and later paraffin, distilled from petroleum, offered cleaner, longer-lasting light at lower cost. But before these materials were widely available, a chaotic marketplace emerged. Candle makers sought to stretch their supplies, to create products that looked like beeswax but were not, or to disguise inferior tallow with dyes, scents, and deceptive packaging. It was here, in this gap between consumer trust and industrial supply, that fraud flourished. Fraudulent practices. The scams were varied, but all were united by their exploitation of the candle's apparent simplicity. A candle, after all, was just a stick of wax with a wick. How complicated could it be? Unscrupulous chandlers discovered several methods of deception. Wax adulteration. Beeswax candles, sold at a premium, were often cut with cheaper tallow or rosin. The result looked convincing, especially when colored with saffron or turmeric to mimic beeswax's golden hue. Buyers only discovered the fraud when their expensive candles smoked and dripped like the cheapest kind. False labeling packages bore claims of pure wax or long burning, yet contained ordinary tallow dipped in thin outer layers of wax. Housewives lit them only to discover they burned down twice as fast as promised. Weighted wicks. Some fraudsters inserted wire or lead into the wicks, making the candle heavier and thus more expensive by weight. These not only cheated customers but could create dangerous sparks when burning. Soapstone and chalk fillers. Perhaps the most brazen scheme involved mixing powdered stone or chalk into the wax. The candles appeared normal but crumbled easily and emitted strange odors. This was not petty tampering but systematic deceit. Investigators would later compare it to the adulteration of bread with alum or milk, with chalk practices that preyed on ignorance and scarcity alike. The spread of the conspiracy. By the 1840s, reports of counterfeit candles surfaced across Britain. Manchester, Birmingham, and London newspapers began to print complaints from readers who claimed their expensive wax candles sputtered out in less than an hour. In Leeds, a chemist who tested samples found they contained less than half the beeswax advertised. The scandal was not limited to small shops. Wholesalers were implicated in distributing adulterated stock. Some even imported counterfeit candles from continental Europe, where similar frauds thrived in Paris and Hamburg. In England's rapidly industrializing cities, it was easy for fraudulent chandlers to hide among legitimate ones, producing vast numbers of fake candles in backroom workshops. Rumors circulated of organized groups who coordinated shipments, ensuring that bad stock was spread thinly enough not to arouse too much suspicion at once. The press seized on the phrase "candle conspiracy," suggesting perhaps with some exaggeration a nationwide network of fraudsters. Public reaction. At first, many ordinary buyers blamed themselves. If a candle sputtered, perhaps it was because they had trimmed the wick incorrectly or exposed it to a draft. Only when failures became widespread did suspicion shift to the makers. By mid-century, however, public outrage grew. Letters to editors accused chandlers of cheating the poor of their light. Religious commentators seized on the metaphor, warning that fraudulent candles symbolized moral decay, false lights leading the faithful astray. Markets grew uneasy. Merchants who had nothing to do with fraud found their stock eyed with suspicion. Sales of all candles dipped in some towns, even as alternatives like whale oil and gaslight remained too costly for the average household. The poor, once again, bore the brunt of the crisis. For them, a wasted candle was not a small inconvenience, but a night spent in darkness. The first investigations. Authorities were slow to act, but by the late 1840s, local inspectors in several towns began to collect samples. Chemists tested candles by melting them down and analyzing their residues. In one case reported in the Morning Chronicle, a so-called pure wax candle left behind an unmistakable crust of chalk. Prosecutions followed, though often with mixed results. Laws governing fraud were limited, and proving adulteration required expensive chemical testimony. Many cases ended in fines rather than prison, leading reformers to argue that the penalties were not enough to deter offenders. Still, these first prosecutions marked the beginning of forensic consumer protection. Just as the Bradford poisoning would later transform attitudes toward sweets, the candle cases highlighted how even the humblest of household goods could become vehicles for crime. A world on the edge of change. The counterfeit candle scandal unfolded at a moment of technological transition. Gaslight, though spreading, was not yet universal. Electricity was still decades away. For millions of families, candles were essential, not optional. That made them the perfect target for fraudsters, who understood that customers had little choice but to keep buying. Yet the very same decade saw the rise of paraffin wax, a petroleum byproduct that promised cheaper, cleaner light. Some historians later argued that the candle conspiracy hastened the adoption of these new fuels. People, once deceived, were quicker to embrace alternatives, even if they distrusted them at first. In this sense, the counterfeiters not only committed crimes, they may have accelerated the end of the very market they exploited. The questions left hanging. The story of the counterfeit candles raises unsettling questions. How many families, cheated of light, simply accepted their losses and suffered in silence? How deeply did the fraud networks reach into legitimate supply chains? Were they truly coordinated, or merely parallel opportunists exploiting the same gaps? And most of all, if light itself could be counterfeited, what other necessities of daily life were vulnerable to deceit? By the mid-19th century, counterfeit candles had gone from whispers in neighborhood markets to a national concern. For every household that complained in private, dozens more grumbled silently, assuming it was simply bad luck. But by 1850, public pressure was mounting. The issue had become too widespread, too consistent, and too costly for families to ignore. And slowly, what began as consumer frustration transformed into a new chapter in the history of forensic investigation. Early chemists take the stage. The first true breakthroughs came not from police detectives but from chemists. Household fraud, whether in food, drink, or light, was increasingly a matter of chemical analysis. Enter men like Arthur Hill Hassall, a physician chemist already known for exposing food adulteration. Hassall and others like him began applying the microscope and the laboratory flask to substances that most Victorians took for granted. They developed simple, yet effective methods for distinguishing pure beeswax from adulterated mixtures. Melting point tests. Pure beeswax melts between 62–64 degrees C. Adulterants like tallow and rosin altered this consistency, so by carefully controlling heat, chemists could catch counterfeiters. Residue analysis. Burning or melting, a sample often left behind chalky residues if adulterated with fillers like plaster or soapstone. Smell and flame. Chemists noted that genuine beeswax produced a steady flame with a faintly sweet aroma. Counterfeits sputtered, smoked, or released acrid odors. Such methods, primitive by today's standards, were revolutionary at the time. They transformed vague suspicions into measurable evidence. The courtroom battles. With chemists supplying testimony, candle fraud cases began reaching magistrates' courts across England. Some were small-scale prosecutions, a local chandler fined for mixing tallow into wax. Others revealed more elaborate schemes, implicating wholesalers and importers. One case in Liverpool in 1852 attracted attention when a merchant was accused of importing thousands of pounds of adulterated wax from the continent. Samples seized by customs officers showed clear traces of chalk and rosin. Though the merchant denied knowledge, insisting he had been duped by suppliers abroad, the court ruled against him. He paid a heavy fine, but no prison sentence was imposed. This outcome frustrated reformers. The profit margins were so high that fines seemed trivial compared to the scale of fraud. The public, reading reports in newspapers, began demanding tougher enforcement. Candle makers strike back. Not all chandlers were corrupt. In fact, many legitimate candle makers were furious at the damage being done to their trade's reputation. Guilds and associations petitioned Parliament, arguing that adulteration laws should be extended to cover candles as well as bread and milk. Some even advertised aggressively, positioning their products as guaranteed pure. Shops displayed signs declaring tested wax only or laboratory certified. Of course, this created another opportunity for fraud, false guarantees and forged certificates. Still, the pressure from honest tradesmen was crucial in pushing the issue into wider debate. The human side of the fraud. Behind the statistics and court reports lay the real lives affected. Imagine a seamstress in Manchester working late into the night to finish garments. She bought candles advertised as long-burning, but they guttered out within an hour. Her livelihood depended on light. Without it, she lost both time and wages. Or consider a family in Birmingham that carefully rationed their household expenses, paying extra for beeswax candles to read scripture by a clean flame. Instead, they received adulterated stock that filled their parlor with smoke and stench. For them, the fraud wasn't just financial, it was spiritual theft. These stories rarely reached the newspapers, but they formed the silent backdrop of frustration that made the counterfeit candle scandal so corrosive to public trust. Whispers of a network. As investigators dug deeper, they began noticing patterns. Fraudulent candles appeared in multiple towns simultaneously, often bearing similar packaging. Some suggested a coordinated distribution system. Wholesalers in London and Birmingham were suspected of operating as hubs, sending adulterated stock outward to local chandlers who either turned a blind eye or eagerly joined in. The word conspiracy was more than just a newspaper flourish. While not a centralized syndicate in the modern sense, the fraud resembled an informal network of opportunists who benefited from shared techniques and distribution channels. Yet unraveling this network proved nearly impossible. Paper trails were thin, receipts could be forged, and because many chandlers bought supplies in bulk without strict documentation, proving intent in court was difficult. Consumer vigilance. Interestingly, some of the strongest resistance came not from officials but from ordinary citizens. Pamphlets circulated advising buyers how to spot adulterated candles. A genuine beeswax candle, when scratched with a fingernail, revealed a consistent golden hue throughout. If cut with a knife, counterfeits often revealed darker or uneven cores. Suspiciously cheap, wax candles were almost certainly fakes. Communities began organizing boycotts of shops suspected of fraud. Housewives compared notes at markets, warning one another of bad suppliers. In an era before consumer rights were formally recognized, these informal networks became a frontline defense against deception. From candles to broader reform. By the late 1850s, the candle fraud cases had merged into the larger movement against food and product adulteration. Parliament, under pressure, passed broader consumer protection measures. The Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860 did not explicitly list candles, but it established principles that could be applied to them. Chemists gained greater authority to test products, and local inspectors had a clearer mandate to seize fraudulent goods. Though enforcement remained patchy, the very fact that lawmakers acknowledged the problem signaled a turning point. The candles' decline. Ironically, even as fraud investigations intensified, the candle itself was slowly losing its monopoly on domestic light. Paraffin wax, introduced in the 1850s, offered cheap, clean-burning alternatives that quickly spread. Gaslight, too, was expanding into middle-class homes, reducing reliance on traditional chandlers. Some historians later remarked that the counterfeiters had, in effect, shortened the candle's lifespan. By undermining trust, they pushed households toward newer technologies. Where once the candle symbolized permanence, it now seemed vulnerable, fragile, and tainted. The unsatisfying outcomes. Despite all the effort, many candle fraud cases ended with fines rather than imprisonment. Few major conspirators were ever exposed, and some likely retired comfortably on their ill-gotten gains. For every prosecution that made headlines, dozens of cases slipped through the cracks. The frustration was palpable. How could such widespread fraud persist in plain sight? Why did authorities hesitate to pursue harsher penalties? Was it simply because candles were seen as too trivial, too ordinary, compared to more sensational crimes? The candle conspiracy, then, was less about a single dramatic climax than about the slow grind of reform. It illustrated how crime could hide in the everyday, how profit could be wrung not from grand robberies, but from shaving half an inch off a wick or mixing chalk into wax. The looming questions. By the close of the 1850s, Britain had witnessed hundreds of small prosecutions, scattered across counties, yet the sense of resolution was incomplete. Fraudulent candles still slipped into shops. Honest chandlers still complained of unfair competition. Consumers still bought with suspicion. And hanging over it all was a larger, unsettling realization. If something as simple as a candle could be so thoroughly corrupted, how much more vulnerable were food, medicine, and even water? The counterfeit candle was no longer just an object of fraud. It had become a symbol of a society grappling with trust in an industrial age. By the 1860s, the counterfeit candle conspiracy was nearing its twilight, not because the fraudsters had been entirely defeated, but because the very product they exploited, the candle, was being eclipsed by new sources of light. Yet before it faded into history, the scandal left deep marks on public trust, consumer law, and the way people thought about everyday objects. The candle's fall from grace. For centuries, the candle had been more than a source of light. It symbolized faith in churches, warmth in homes, and guidance on ships. But by the mid-19th century, its symbolic power was overshadowed by practical failure. Consumers who once associated beeswax candles with reliability and purity now saw them as suspicious, overpriced, and prone to fraud. Letters to newspapers reflected this shift. One writer to the Times in 1863 complained, "It is no longer possible to purchase a candle without doubt. We are cheated in the shop and cheated again in the burning, and left in darkness for our pains." Such sentiments reveal the depth of disillusionment. A household staple had become a symbol of distrust. The rise of paraffin. Paraffin wax, distilled from coal and later petroleum, entered the British market around the 1850s. It offered several advantages. It was cheaper than beeswax. It burned cleaner, producing little smoke. It was harder to adulterate, since its manufacturing process was industrial rather than artisanal. By the 1860s, paraffin candles were flooding markets in Scotland and northern England, where the petroleum industry was booming. Consumers welcomed them eagerly, not simply because they were cheaper, but because they carried no history of fraud. To the weary public, paraffin represented honesty. For counterfeiters, this shift was catastrophic. Their methods, perfected on beeswax, did not translate to paraffin. Fraudulent blends were harder to conceal, and consumers now had a cheaper alternative anyway. In a sense, technology accomplished what the courts never fully could. It undercut the counterfeiter's business model. Gaslight and the death of the chandelier. While paraffin made candles cheaper, gaslight was reshaping urban life entirely. By the late 19th century, much of London and other industrial cities were lit by gas. This form of illumination was beyond the reach of adulterators. It was municipal, industrial, and large-scale. To households that could afford it, gaslight symbolized progress and modernity. It provided a steady flame that could not be tricked with chalk or soap fillers. And as gas spread, the domestic candle's role shrank further, confined to poorer households or ceremonial uses. The candle conspiracy began to feel almost quaint, a relic of a bygone age where crime lurked in handmade goods, exposed only by the careful eye of chemists and reformers. The reformers' legacy. Still, the fight against counterfeit candles was not in vain. It had helped establish principles of consumer protection that endured far beyond wax and wick. Reformers like Arthur Hill Hassall laid the groundwork for professional food inspectors and public analysts who could test everyday goods. The lessons learned about chemical testing, about the need for harsher penalties, about the ease with which fraud-infiltrated households were applied to milk, bread, beer, and later to pharmaceuticals. In fact, The candle cases were often cited in parliamentary debates as evidence of why consumer laws needed teeth. If candles could be corrupted, argued reformers, anything could be. Stories of persistence. Though many counterfeiters escaped with fines, some cases stood out as victories. One trial in 1865, for example, saw a Birmingham wholesaler sentenced to several months in prison after inspectors found barrels of wax that were little more than tallow and plaster dust molded into shape. Newspapers reported the story with glee, describing the fraudulent candles as more brick than beeswax. The case reassured the public that fraud would not always go unpunished. Yet these victories were rare. Most prosecutions ended in fines, and many consumers resigned themselves to disappointment. The fraud, in the end, was more corrosive to trust than to health. The candle as metaphor. As the candle's importance waned, its story took on metaphorical power. To some Victorians, it represented the fragility of trust in an industrializing world. To others, it was a cautionary tale of how profit could erode honesty even in the humblest of trades. Writers occasionally used candle fraud as a metaphor in political speeches. One reformer in 1870 declared, "If a man cannot purchase a candle without deceit, what hope has he in larger matters? Fraud, like smoke, seeps into every crevice." The image stuck. A candle burning dimly, weakened by hidden chalk, became shorthand for everyday corruption. The quiet survivors. Not all chandlers succumbed to fraud. Many family-run shops continued to sell genuine beeswax and tallow candles, surviving on the loyalty of neighbors who trusted them. In rural parishes, where gaslight and paraffin were slower to arrive, these honest chandlers held on for decades. In some ways, their persistence mattered most. They represented an alternative to fraud, proof that trust could be preserved even in a trade so compromised. Their candles lit weddings, funerals, and parish halls long after the counterfeiters had faded. The candle's final decline. By the late 19th century, electricity entered the scene. At first, it was a curiosity, illuminating exhibitions and railway stations, but soon it spread into homes. Once again, light became something beyond fraud, generated not from wax or wick but from invisible currents. In this new world, the counterfeit candle conspiracy became a historical footnote. Fraudsters had moved on to other commodities, chasing profits where consumer protections remained weak. Candles themselves became symbolic, used in churches, on birthday cakes, or for ambience rather than necessity. Yet the story did not vanish entirely. Historians, reformers, and even novelists looked back on the candle fraud era as an example of how mundane crime could reveal larger truths about society. The long shadow. The legacy of the counterfeit candle conspiracy was not the prosecutions themselves, nor the specific frauds uncovered, but the broader shift in public consciousness. People began asking hard questions. How can consumers protect themselves against fraud? What role should the government play in safeguarding daily life? Where else might deception be hiding? These questions fueled reforms that went far beyond candles. They influenced debates about water purity, medicine labeling, and industrial safety. They helped build the foundations of modern consumer rights. The candle, in other words, flickered into history not as a trivial household object, but as a catalyst for change.